The amount of people that I've seen their posts come up my Instagram or my Facebook. Now I I can have a little bit of a fiery Instagram and Facebook every now and again, but I'm okay with it. But the amount of times that I've come across people, let's say, okay, on Facebook, if somebody unfriends you, you both unfriend each other. But on Instagram, if somebody unfollows you, you don't know until maybe you just check. And the amount of times I've had people who I literally were like, I was like, I thought we were good. Right. And you see that they don't want to deal with you. And it's literally comes down to the fact that, like, I had someone the other day who unfollowed me, and I messaged them, and I know them, and I said, hey, I won't put them on blast, okay, but I'll be at least like, hey, what? I thought we were cool. And they were like, I don't like some of the stuff you're posting. It's not funny to me. And they were like, and I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, and it was about Trump. And they were like, well, if you support Trump and he puts down people of color and all this kind of stuff. And I just went, you know what? I just responded. I said, if you truly believe that the president puts down people of color or women, that's an ignorance that I'm happy to part with, because it's pure ignorance. It's such a pure ignorance statement to make. And people, like you said, are feeding off of this, narrative of I'm going to just ingest everything that's given to me by way of one form of media.
It's also, that's a passive aggressive power play. They don't want to follow your Instagram posts regardless of whatever you might post, but also it's bad for them because it creates more of an echo chamber for them. Now they're not getting an alternative viewpoint, and they don't need to agree with what you say, but they should be open to hearing it. And it's difficult to convey a well thought out message over an Instagram meme, but it does contribute to people only hearing the information that they already confirm in their own mind.
I can't even start a group now on Facebook. Like Facebook told me the other day, you were indefinitely suspended from forming groups. You were indefinitely suspended from starting events. Like, there was a whole bunch of shit that they hit me for. And I'm like, that's all down to somebody or people, multiple people most likely, saying, fuck this guy. So then why do you think we would turn to something else? And then that gets shut down itself. Anyway, that's another story.
My name is John, and this is Please Allow Me. Today I get to catch up with a really interesting cat. He's an amateur historian and the first Irish-born fighter in UFC history. He's now a proud U.S. citizen, an unapologetic Trumper, a Second Amendment advocate, MMA trainer to the stars, and cigar aficionado. We spend a lot of time talking about Irish history, including the Troubles and the IRA, because that shit, frankly, it fascinates me. We talked about modern Irish culture, and we touch on current state of MMA, playing the trumpet, and what the hell does the term plastic paddy mean. Please allow me to introduce Tom the Tank Egan. Tom the Tank Egan, my man, how are you?
I'm very good, and this whiskey is delicious. What do you say, Highland Park?
Highland Park, 18-year Viking pride, whatever that means.
Unbelievable. It's delicious. I wonder what not to cut you off, they call it Highland Park, which Highland is a very Scottish thing, Highlands. It tastes like a real Highland Scotch. But the Viking pride, I wonder where the Viking thing comes. I don't know much about Scotland and its relationship with Vikings.
Isn't there something to do with, like, the Vikings came from the north through Germany and then moved through the Iberian Peninsula and then up north through Ireland and Scotland and the UK? Is there something like that?
Well, they sailed all around different ports. So, like, I know in Ireland, they landed in Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. They landed in multiple different ports, and they were, like, coming from all sides. And I do know that they obviously fought a lot of Anglo-Saxons in England. But I don't actually know any of their relationship with, I'm sure the Celts or Celtic tribes in Scotland probably fought them, but it's interesting. I've never really put Scotland and Vikings in the same. Irish Celts. There's a famous battle on my birthday, the Battle of Clontarf, 1012 AD, 1012 or 1014 AD, in Clontarf in Dublin, and it was a vicious amount of people died that day. But it ended up in a rout of the Vikings. They left Ireland altogether. It was a massive, massive battle. They had, like, multiple contingents all throughout. Vikings were coming from Denmark to fight this battle in Dublin, and Yeah, it was an Irish Celtic contingent versus a Celtic and Norse contingent in Dublin, and they won. So I know that, and then of course I know a lot of the English stuff. But it's interesting, Highland Park whiskey with the Viking pride. Maybe I got to look into that.
Well, aren't there four major Scotch regions? Like there's Highland, Lowland, Islay, and
Islay. The Islay Scotches. Yeah, the Islay Scotches are the ones that we know are the very smoky ones because they take a lot of the water that runs through the peat bogs, which is definitely more on the lowland. That type of turf that they would cut and they would burn it for fire because it's a slow burn. But if you ever smell peat being burnt, it has a really like earthy, smoky, smell to it. Right. And then when you taste like one of my favorites is Lagavulin. Yep. I was gonna have you get. I was gonna mention that, but I'm like I don't want my boy buying like $120.
That's $130.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Well, it tastes unbelievable. Then
yeah.
I told you not to buy the expensive stuff.
I mean, look, you're coming down here. You're parking your big ass truck in this tiny little garage. You gotta at least enjoy your cocktail.
Jesus, but I mean, it tastes unbelievable. That actually tastes. If you were to put a blindfold on me and taste that, I would have said that that's almost like the Macallan 16 or the Macallan 18.
There must be some connection. If you couldn't tell, Tom is from Ireland. He's Irish born and now resides here in America. But I think that there has to be something with the two words, right? The peninsula that Spain and Portugal are on, that's the Iberian Peninsula. And I know that where I'm from, a lot of the Irish American groups, there's one called the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Mm-hmm. So I wondered, Guido, can you look that up? Is there something to do with Iberia? Is there something? The word must have something.
I actually don't know that one.
Yeah. And I know that that would be interesting to know. What's that? Oh, might take a bit. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, I would have pegged you for more of an Irish whiskey guy being from Ireland, but you prefer the Scotch.
Well, don't get me wrong. I love my Irish whiskey. And actually, there's a whiskey called Clontarf Whiskey, which is named after the Battle of Clontarf in Dublin. And so I like to always drink that right around my birthday. Obvious reasons. The battle happened on my birthday. It's a great day to share a birthday with. But yeah, no, I love all the Irish whiskey. But there's something about the wintertime, the cold weather that I like an earthy smokiness to it. But this is unbelievable. Unbelievable. Have you ever tried Lagavulin, by the way?
I have. I don't love really Scotch as much. The brown liquor is kind of like
oh yeah.
Yeah, I start to rearrange small towns when I get too much of that stuff. So I do have a guest scheduled though who's like an expert on tequila and mezcal. Mm-hmm. So he's gonna like give me a walkthrough on the tequila and mezcal stuff. A lot of the mezcal that I've had around here is a little bit too smoky for my taste. I also don't like the añejo tequilas. Mm-hmm. Same thing, because they're kind of like, I think, I'm no expert on this, but I think that they're done in an oak cask also, and so depending on the type of wood, if the wood's been burned at all, it kind of gives it a different flavor.
Aged, it can give you a flavor, like a whiskey flavor.
Totally. So that's why on tequila, I go for the silvers
to keep you away from the brown stuff.
Keep me away from the brown stuff. Keep me away from that flavor. And I know that like the blancos and the silvers, people complain a little bit that there's too much of the tequila or agave taste. Mm-hmm. I prefer that over the peaty, mossy taste of some of the scotches and things like that.
Now, what about gin? You drink gin?
I drink gin from time to time, but I did have an episode on some gin that kind of ruined me, and I think an
innocent episode.
Yeah. I drank too much of it one weekend. I'll drink it in mixed drinks, but I'll never drink gin straight. It's too much for me.
I have a friend of mine from Kerry, good man, Porrick Doyle is his name, and he actually has kind of turned me onto gin a little bit. But there's like some Irish gins out there, and all kinds of funky. They put these funky labels on. Like there's one called, I believe it's called like Martha's Gin, but Martha is a cow, and there's a picture of a cow on the like. It's kind of cool stuff, but it's delicious. And like I understand why he likes it, because it does get you fucked up pretty quick. Because it's not as like, it doesn't taste as super potent as like a tequila or a whiskey. Yeah, it just goes down. Yeah. And next thing you know, you're jammed up.
Yeah, and but it's like anything else. Like people who have spent time drinking really shitty tequila, they think they don't like tequila, but they've just never had a good tequila.
Right.
Same thing with gin. I mean, you could taste like you're doing a shot of a Christmas tree. Mm-hmm. That's because you're drinking the shit, right? When you're drinking the good stuff, it tastes a lot different.
I like what is it? Is it Don Julio? Is it 1972 or something?
Oh yeah, that's I think 1942.
1942 or something like that.
Yeah, The tall thin bottle.
I like that one. I mean, I've had that with ice, just drinking it. What's the one that's in like a ceramic bottle?
Oh, that's a Casa Azul, I think. Or
Casa Azul.
Yeah.
I had that New Year's Eve, just this past New Year's Eve, with my buddy Seth, and I was like, I could just sip on it neat, just really nice, you know.
I'm very new to tequila, so I'm actually trying to learn a whole bunch about it. So I've tried all these different flavors and varieties, and I just kind of like, I needed to stop every time I went somewhere to a function, or like, you know, anytime I have to wear my adult watch, I feel like I should behave like an adult. And it's not really conducive to like chugging beers and McGillicuddies. So I had to find something to drink. So I decided, let me just try and get into tequila.
To be an adult, yeah.
And it kind of took.
Here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Tequila, is it, where is tequila? It's Mexican, right?
Yes.
But is it as big in Mexico as it is in the U.S.? Has it become a U.S. thing? Kind of like burrito. Burritos it's a Mexican food, but it became it's an American thing.
So
right?
From what I understand, and I'm actually going to Mexico next month, so I'll be happy to report back. From what I understand, mezcal is a little bit more popular right now because the range of flavors that are produced by mezcal is a little bit broader than that of tequila. I also do understand from people who are back and forth to Mexico that the tequila they're producing there is a lot different than what they're exporting to the U.S. So I'm not really sure what's bigger and or if it's as big here. It's kind of like I remember actually going to Ireland and thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm going to drink all this beer. And then I found that when I was in Ireland, the beer selection was fairly shitty in most places in Dublin.
Yes.
It was kind of like, I think we were...
it's like Heineken, Carlsberg, Guinness.
Carlsberg, yeah. And I said, where's the Harp? Because the Irish bars here, I used to always drink Harp. And someone in Dublin told me, that's the wild man's beer. You have to find that up north.
Yeah.
And it's made in the same factory as the Guinness is.
Right.
So I found that was a little bit the Carlsberg.
Do you like it?
No.
It's watery.
It's watery.
My dad's actually a big My dad likes Carlsberg every now and again. I'm actually more. I'd be more on the side of Heineken. I actually do like a Heineken. But here's the thing: in Ireland, you know, when you go to bars there, especially in Dublin, it's mostly. I mean, when's the last time you were there?
10 years ago.
Yeah, Dublin's not the same in my opinion. I mean, when you go to Dublin now, it's just like you barely recognize. It's all foreigners all over the place. I mean, I'm not trying to knock foreigners. I'm just trying to say I'm a foreigner now, but I'm an American now. But anyways, I'm saying when you go there, it's like you very rarely hear Irish bands. You hear a lot of foreign languages all around the place. A lot of people, you know, Europe, Eastern Europe, and whatnot. I mean, fair enough. Dublin's a real touristy place.
It's also become a cosmopolitan city, right?
Correct. And so that's why when I go and backpackers, people, you know, the hostels are always jammed, people floating around different places. So when I go to Ireland, I don't go to Dublin anymore. I actually can't stand it, to be honest with you. Unless I'm bringing somebody to go experience certain areas, I don't go to Dublin. Totally. The countryside's the way to go for me.
Last time I went, I wish I had listened to people that said, look, go to Galway and then finish up 2 days in Dublin. You don't need more than that.
Yep.
And I was like, no, I'm a city guy. I want to be in the city. So we went to Dublin and then made our way out west. And I wish I had done it in reverse. It's a very different, like, it's a beautiful city, but you're in a city like almost any other city.
Yeah.
There's a weird thing about Dublin also, and I had read this when I was there, and you can obviously speak more to this, that basically Dublin kind of almost skipped over the Industrial Revolution and they went straight from like agriculture to tech. And so there seems to be a weird like gap in visually what you see represented by the remnants here of like the Industrial Revolution, and not a lot of factories and things like that. You've got agriculture and then tech. But I mean, again, I was just a tourist.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's definitely, you can see where there are parts of Dublin that would be very medieval. And then, all of a sudden it's just like brand new buildings, you know? Right. So there's definitely, versus like some other cities, you know, they, like you said, they have that, you know, that bridge of time where, like, you know, you could see things happen over time, versus Dublin has that very like old and then new. Right. But yeah, like I said, when I go to Dublin now, it's for me, I don't really enjoy it because part of the thing is you want to go to Ireland, you want to sit down, you want to hear all the Irish banter. You know, I don't want to go to Japan. Well, Japan's a bad example because they don't let anybody in. But I don't want to go to another place and hear other. You know, you want to go there for that specific area.
For the crack. For
the crack, exactly.
How long have you been here?
So I've been here actually 11 years now. 11 years. Well, I first arrived Well, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. I've been coming to the U.S. as a kid with my parents and my younger brother on vacations and stuff like that, because it's a thing in Ireland where, obviously we don't have really good summers and our weather is always rainy and shitty in Ireland. God bless it. It's great sometimes, but sometimes you're like, I need some sunshine. So a lot of families, what they'll do is they'll once a year they'll do like a Spain trip, or it's kind of like our Florida. Spain's like Europe's Florida,
Right.
And they'll go there. A lot of families will go there once a year. If they'll save up, they'll get like cheap packages, fly there, stay there, and come home. My parents, I don't know, maybe how it happened. Maybe my grandfather ended up in New York on some business years and years ago. My father was still like, late teens, early 20s. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but either way, my parents decided to be like, well, fuck it. Instead of going to like Spain or doing some shitty vacation once a year, let's save up. And then every 2-3 years, go to Florida. Take the boys to Disneyland or whatever, and then we did a family trip to New York. So all those years of like, coming to America, me and my brother grew up very, familiar with American culture, the whole world kind of is. Even in Ireland, we're very Americanized in the sense that when American culture, when something was going on in America, it influenced a lot of things. It would influence England, Ireland, different parts of Europe, just based on this is where a lot of things would go down. So I've been to the U.S. multiple times as a kid, but the first time I came to Boston and kind of made moves to essentially end up. What led to me end up staying here for a long time was in February of 2009, shortly after my UFC debut, and then the following year, January 5th, I had kind of made moves that December of 2009 to kind of make moves to be able to come over here and say, right, let me at least go here for 3 months, take some of the contacts that I'd met in 2009, and see what I could do. I had a good friend of mine, Frank Delaney is his name. He used to own the what was known as the Black Rose. Oh, sorry, the Blackthorn on Broadway.
Oh yeah,
you know it.
I'm familiar.
And he used to own that, and he ran a couple of other bars in Boston. And when I was here in 2009, he turned around to me and he says, "Hey, if you ever need a place to stay, if you ever want to give it a go, coming over here, just let me know." And funny enough, I just bumped into him the other day, and I was able to just say, "Hey, we try to stay in touch, text and whatever." But like when I saw him in person for the first time in a while the other day, I was able to be like, "Frank, I'm here fucking 11 years now. I'm a citizen. I just got to tell you, like, I just gave him a big hug, and I was like, you were the guy who said to me, if you need a place to stay, come out here." And then sure enough, I met Peter Welch. Peter was growing his gym, asked me if I wanted to get on board. I said, yeah. And then next thing you know, I'm here
11 years later.
11 years later.
Here we are.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you landed in Boston because of the Irish contacts here. And obviously, at one time, this was a landing spot for Irish immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
At one time. I don't know if it still is as much. This whole area is gentrifying and things like that.
Right.
So it's probably pretty easy for you to have come here and assimilated. What is it about American descendants of Ireland that makes them so proud of their heritage, do you think? I don't see it in very many other cultures, maybe the Italians, where there are Americans that with a sliver of Irish heritage will claim to be, straight off the boat and they love it. What is it about the Irish heritage to you that makes people feel that way?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot that you can say about, I think, you kind of see it in a lot of different aspects of life or culture where people want to cling on to the underdog. They want to cling on to the guy who's kind of struggling and whatnot. And the Irish culture is even though there's, right now, well, according to the last census, we're obviously still waiting on the results of the latest one. But according to the last census, Irish people who consider themselves Irish American are the second largest ethnic group in the United States, with over 60 million people who identify as that. That's insane. The number one is German American, then it goes Irish American, and then I believe the next one after that it's a tie between like Italian and something else. But which is what's incredible, even though there's so many of us here. Yeah, I think they cling on to the underdog story. I'll give you a story real quick. Maybe this is the reason why, who knows? But there's a friend of mine, his name's John Sabri. He's an old school Lebanese guy. He's a car dealer in Quincy, right next to Trifecta. Big cigar guy. But He grew up in Lebanon, fought in a couple wars that they had there, and then he ended up coming over to America in his 20s, joined the Marines, got blown up by an RPG in Grenada during the Grenada conflict during Reagan years, got discharged, went and became a math professor, married a woman who was into money, married into basically millions, made his own way through life, and then divorced, multiple kids, came out to Boston, some Lebanese guys that he knew, and now he just sells cars and he smokes cigars, and I hang out with him, right? And he's all scarred up all over his body from his years in the Marines. And he said to me very funny one day, he goes, Tom, the fucking British, they could have people halfway across the world, India, New Zealand, Australia, they didn't have to do nothing. They just followed suit to the crown. But the Irish, they fucked them in the ass. They can't control the Irish. What the fuck? And I was like, well, that's a pretty impressive thing. A little tiny island right off the coast of England. England, essentially the roots of our Constitution came from Old English common law. And, they established some of the, greatest advancements in due process and whatnot. Obviously, we took it a step further. But like a civilization a country and a culture like that was able to govern countries so far away that would take you days and days, if not weeks and months to get to, and yet somehow their next door neighbors they couldn't govern them. So maybe people in Ireland cling to that kind of gritty, don't give up kind of mentality. I think it could be something to do with that,
What and so here in Boston, I hear from a lot of people who are more direct descendants of Ireland the term plastic paddy. What does that mean? Is that mocking us?
So
fucked up.
So here's my view. I love when I see someone who's Irish descent. You see, when someone is like American, but they're descendant of, there might be second or third generation Asian or black or Hispanic, they look at there's a physical appearance of it, so it's more believable. But because so many, let's say somebody who might be German descent versus somebody who's Irish descent, because we're Caucasian, it sometimes can be hard to distinguish, physically, what one or the other is.
Right,
in
country of origin.
Right, in Ireland, a lot of the time our distinction between what was an Irish person and an English person was your religion. So, they call a lot of the things that went on in Northern Ireland and all throughout Ireland and the Troubles, as I know we were talking about earlier, is they look at it as a religious war, but it was more so an identity war. It was more so Ireland versus saying, but what distinguished an Irish person from an English person? A lot of the time when they really kind of narrowed it down in the late 1800s, it came down to your faith. And if you're Catholic, you're Irish. And if you're Protestant, you're English. A lot of that you could say, talking about the Battle of Clontarf, which we mentioned earlier on, you could relate it back to Brian Boru, who was king at the time during the Battle of Clontarf, and Brian Boru was pretty much Ireland's only united king. He united all of Ireland under his banner before they ended up fighting the Vikings.
What year was that?
The battle was 1012 or 1014, right around there, and he was ordained under the Catholic Church. When he united Ireland, and when he became the United King of Ireland, he was ordained as a Catholic king. And so you could maybe say that a lot of the Irish culture kind of stemmed along from Brian Boru being Catholic and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, the plastic paddy term, me personally, I hate it. I mean, for crying out loud, I'm fucking Irish. I speak fluent Gaelic. I'm the first Irish cunt to ever fight in the UFC, and I get called a plastic paddy just because I love America. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous, the whole term. It's a way, I think it's a way for Irish guys who come over here, or girls, they come over here, they cling on to they cling on to their Irish culture. Instead of celebrating the fact that you have an American who might be second or third generation or a sliver of Irish culture, like you mentioned, they might have more English descent than Irish descent in their culture, but they cling on to that Irish descent. And like for someone to come over here from Ireland, all of a sudden assume or not buy into the fact that there's an American here who really loves our culture and they're really proud of being Irish. And the way I say it, better you want to represent the Irish colors than the English colors. I mean, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the plastic paddy term for me really bothers me when I any young people that come over from Ireland and they kind of mention that term. I'm like, hey, remember, there's people here who cling on to that, and that's a good thing.
Right,
that's
right.
a good thing.
Well, there was a guy I know. He was over here, and he was from like Donegal, and he called everyone a plastic patty. Then he goes and marries a German girl and has a kid. And I was like, how does it feel to know that I'm more Irish than your son? And that didn't go over too well.
Yeah,
too well with him.
yeah. Well, I mean that's the funny thing, right? They call you. I always joke. I put up a meme on, the Drake meme where it's like that and then that.
Yeah.
And on the meme part where Drake's like this, I was like Tom Egan speaking his language and promoting it and encouraging everybody else to do it, especially in a foreign country. And then like the hands like this, and then where he's like that, it's like give him shit for loving a country that he's lived in over a decade. You know what I mean? Because I love America so much, but Ireland and America are synonymous with each other. There's no reason to assume that because you love America that all of a sudden you're not Irish. And this is the problem with our youth. They're so, but then again, these same people will fall in love and like be obsessed with British Premier League soccer teams. So, bro, what are you, bro? Are you a fucking British soccer team fan, or are you giving me shit over, loving America, a country that shares similar ties? In fact, George Washington, the father of the country, said that he would make his stand with the Irish, with the Ulster Irish, if he would ever make a last stand, it would be with the Ulster Irish. Like, come on.
I think there's two answers to that. Like one, I feel like for a lot of Americans, because we're such a melting pot here in general, that there's not like an identity. Like if you go to Japan or you go to another country where they don't have a lot of immigrants there, the culture, you understand the culture, and people have that to latch onto. But here in America, because we're such a melting pot, people kind of forget like where their ancestors come from. And in some ways, it can be healthy for people to latch onto that, and some people do it. Obviously, dosage is critical in anything. Right. People who kind of go overboard, it can become unhealthy. Yeah. The English Premier League soccer thing, I think that's a hipster thing. I think it's a thing that people get into in because they for some reason they want to act like they're too good for American football. I'm so educated.
Oh, for people over here, yeah. Oh, yeah. Here it's definitely a hipster thing.
Yeah, I'm so educated and worldly that I'm not going to cheer for the Patriots or the Giants.
I'm a Man United guy. Yeah,
I'm a Man United guy.
But in Ireland, it's like the same people that will walk around with a Manchester United or a Liverpool, which are two British teams. You got their best players getting knighted by the crown, like guys like Wayne Rooney or whatever. They're getting awarded awards by the British crown. All of a sudden, that's okay. But because I'm over here in America, or people who are American and Irish. Oh, yeah, that's a plastic patty. What the fuck does that even mean? You know what I mean? Because it's like if you're American or if you're either American and Irish descent, repping the Irish colors, or you're an Irishman who comes to America and then you assimilate in and you love America for obviously the very historic ties. I mean, right over here, there's islands here in Boston, like Deer Island, for example, where hundreds, if not thousands, of Irish people landed during the Irish famine, where America opened their arms and said, we'll take you in. And, we came here. Yeah, it wasn't the most welcoming vibe, but we dug our feet in and we made America our own. We didn't cause trouble for the most part. We dug in deep into businesses and dug in deep into particularly law, became police officers, lawyers, judges, and eventually politicians. I mean, you had politicians in Boston that were Irish representing Jewish parts, which is amazing. Maybe it's the gift of the gab that some Irish people have. Who knows? But I'm saying, like, you have Irish people who cling on to British culture and then have the nerve to then call an Irish American or someone like myself who's Irish, speaks Irish, knows a lot about my history, has done things on a world stage when it comes to Ireland. And then I come to America and then all of a sudden that's being a plastic pot. It doesn't make any sense. That's because they're tapped.
Is it in some way like some way to like imply that there's a sellout factor or anything like that?
Oh, I mean, this is the weird thing, John. This is what I don't understand in Ireland. There are sellout, but what I've actually found myself personally, what I found is that people in Ireland who follow the maybe not so much, it's the people who follow the British sports and who engulf themselves in that British culture with like the Premier League and whatnot, and maybe even the rugby. They're always the ones to point the finger at a person or at an Irish person coming to America and loving American culture versus the people who do a lot of the Gaelic Irish sports like Gaelic hurling and all that. Because in Ireland, there actually is a little bit of a, I guess you could say, discrimination between people who live in the west of Ireland, in the east of Ireland, who are, sometimes can be your rugby, soccer people, versus the people those are people in the east versus people in the west who grow up with the Irish language, do all the Irish cultural sports and whatnot. And it's noticeable. It's noticeable that people who grow up speaking certain language, like their native tongue in Ireland, are always somehow discriminated against in a slight way versus people on the East Coast. People on the East Coast tend to think themselves more uppity, They tend to think of themselves more like, we're with it a little bit more. You people in the West, you're stuck in the ages.
Is there a difference in general in the education level of the people in the East versus the people in the West? Are there more universities in the East than in the West? And is there a...
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it can stem from like the likes of the fact that, Dublin was a place initially where like the British were ruling majority out of that. You go back even further, that was where if there were aristocrats in Dublin or in Ireland, they would have been around the East Coast. But yeah, I mean, we've got an amazing university in Galway, which is all the way in the East Coast, on the West Coast, but University of Galway, it's English speaking. You've got people from different parts of Ireland that go there, and they're not really there. They're not like people from Galway who grew up in the Gaelic speaking parts, in the rural areas, the fishing parts, out in where it's all broken up into those little islands. I mean, they're the real kind of like, West Coast people. And there is a discrimination. There has been. I mean, you can attribute it, honestly, to it being part of the Irish government's fault during the troubled times, from the 60s up until the 90s, when, you had what we knew then as the provisional IRA causing a lot of havoc in the north of Ireland, but they prided themselves off of being Irish, the language, and they claimed that they were fighting for the language and the culture and whatnot. Now, there's an argument on both sides, which I won't necessarily take a stance on this podcast. So I'm still obviously, learning both sides of it, but there's a stance that would say that those were terrorist attacks that they were doing, and that
by the Northerners,
by the provisional IRA. Now, likewise on both sides, you have Protestant organizations in the north who are also terrorists, who kind of like what we see today. You see Trump supporters having a pissed off day, but then all of a sudden the media forgets about the 6 months of burning and looting of cities and killing police officers and civilians, and all of a sudden that doesn't matter anymore. It's like news cycles about this one day, and they call it an insurrection and whatnot. But what about the insurrection on Trump's inauguration day, when fucking Antifa were there smashing windows and fighting people and causing all kinds of violence? Right. So it's like I said, so
it's very subjective.
Yeah, of course. So in the north, the Protestants, even though they had their own terrorist groups who were doing bad things, they were getting a slap on the wrist, or they weren't getting viewed quite similarly as the IRA were. And then obviously you have people who sympathize with the IRA did, but the Irish government certainly, you could almost say during the time of Margaret Thatcher, in Ireland in the 80s, you could say they almost put a foot down, or they started singling out that identifying yourself with being patriotic and the Irish colours and the language and being super prideful of being Irish. They were linking that to what the IRA were doing in the north. Mm-hmm. So you were looked at as like terrorists. Like if somebody hung an Irish flag outside their house in Ireland, you could almost be like, oh, geez, are they they would say in Ireland, they're a bit raw, aren't they? They got raw heads on them. As if to say that, they're linking being prideful in your language to that. So you could almost say that over time that the people on the East Coast were very snobby and educated, and we're the anointed, the elites. The people on the West Coast, so they're lower than us. We're more progressive, and that's usually always where progressivism goes. It ends up being where they look at themselves as the higher people, and then they look down at other people. They claim progressivism is supposed to be where you accept people, but it's really not. It eventually graduates or gradually gets to the point where people ignore and they turn a blind eye and they don't want to hear another side.
Right.
I went off there a little bit.
No, I think that's fine, and I think you can draw a lot of analogies from what it sounds like you're talking about the East Coast of Ireland to kind of like either coast in the United States, and what's in between the West Coast and the East Coast. But before we get into that, I want to ask you some clarifying questions. Timeline-wise, when you talk about the Irish and the IRA and things like that, what's the timeline from when you had the United King of Ireland in the 1000s to a point where you're arguing over the counties in the north, the British rule, independence? Can you give a rough timeline of that and how that all transpired?
Yeah, so, I mean, going back even further than that, I mean, you had, like, Celtic prominence was all throughout Northern Europe. I mean, well, before Caesar's time and during Caesar's time, during the Roman Empire, I mean, Gaelic was spoken all throughout Northern Europe for 1,500 years. The Celts showed up on historic radars when the ancient Greek encountered them in eastern Turkey, and they called them Keltoi, and they were known as like the men of the East. And there's a lot of evidence that, even though we don't have 100% like literature and documentation of it, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the Celts originated in the Middle East, and then they made their way across all the way through Northern Europe. Obviously during the Roman Empire and whatnot, but they were definitely first recorded in history in eastern Turkey, which is pretty east. And then they're making their way all the way up through Northern Europe at the time. But Gaelic was very well spoken for the guts of 1,500 years in Northern Europe. Like the Galatian era or the Galatian times, that's just a Latin term for Gaelic.
Okay.
Galatian, Gaelic, right. Gaul.
Yep.
They were the Gaels. They all spoke Gaelic at the time. Vercingetorix was a very famous warrior from that time. There's a movie about it. It's a shitty movie. I wish they'd redo it. Vercingetorix was known for wearing the helmet with the wings on it. Yep. They attributed that. It's funny, in the comic book, in the Marvel comic books, they have Thor wearing the helmet with the wings. That's actually a Celtic thing, not a Norse thing. The Vikings actually didn't actually wear horns, from what I understand. It was actually, the Celts were a lot more known for wearing horns and deer antlers on their helmets, presenting themselves as bigger or greater. They saw the stag as being something divine. So whenever they had stag antlers, very ceremonious things, they would have big, massive stag antlers on their helmets, and or even attached to a crown or whatnot. But so you had those periods of time, which eventually ended up with the Celts being in Great Britain and eventually in Ireland. And, Ireland at one point in time, when it was mostly tribal and mostly Celtic, we were, for such a small island, we were broken up into 4 different provinces, right? And competing amongst each other, making peace, sometimes battles, sometimes not. And it wasn't until the Vikings started coming around that all of a sudden there was a need for uniting. And when the Vikings started coming around in, the later part of, I guess you could say, the first century after Christ, there was definitely a need for it. And that's where the Battle of Clontarf was obviously the pinnacle part of that time. And then after that, which is unfortunate because Brian Boru, again, it's funny how history works. Brian Boru was slain that day. He was killed that day. He knew that the Irish were on the verge or on the brink of a win. And he went and prayed in his tent on the battlefield. And a rogue Viking came in and axed him in the head as he was praying. Killed him.
Wow.
His son died in battle. And then his grandson, Trailoch, actually died. It's a tradition that myself and my younger brother are going to start doing, is on my birthday on the 23rd, to commemorate the Battle of Clontarf, but to commemorate Brian Boru's lineage, which essentially was wiped out that day because his son and his grandson were killed. His grandson Trailoch was killed they were beating the Vikings so bad that the Vikings were scrambling to get on their boats. It's not we know the Vikings as
right,
but that day the Celts put the fear of God in the Vikings, and they beat them so bad that they were getting on their boats.
Get the hell out of Dodge.
To get the fuck out of there. They were paddling out, and the Celts were like killing them on their way out. But Trailoch famously, along with a bunch of other Celts, put a sword in his mouth and fucking swam out after them to get on their boats. And he drowned on his way out there. It must have been with them paddling so hard to get out there. And he was swimming out to get them. He wanted to get on that boat and keep killing. He was ready to die on those boats. Think about that. That's fucking insane. So he put it. Yeah, he went out and he drowned. So me and my brother were looking to we're looking to start a tradition of every day on my birthday, I'm gonna go home to Ireland. I'm gonna go swimming in that bay of Clontarf to kind of commemorate that. But anyways, from that point on,
that's awesome. By the way,
unbelievable.
Yeah,
it's fucking badass. It's just badass. Why don't we have a statue of that guy? So from that point on, Ireland at that point there was a bit of a vacuum, and so that's 1014, and then obviously you have a few hundred years of some toning down in Ireland, and I believe it was somewhere around the 13 or 1400s where the Anglo-Saxons started coming over little by little and setting foot in Dublin, and then there was a time where they got a little too comfortable, and a bunch of Celts in Ireland got together and they said, we need to get them the fuck out of here. So they booted them out, basically, arrested a bunch, killed a bunch, and then sent the rest packing. Then a couple hundred years later, same thing. They said Britain at the time had really kind of been establishing itself, and they started coming over little by little. And before you know it, we had English law in Ireland, and then now we're fighting on the back foot. You had a lot of people in Ireland actually during the time when they kicked them out the first time, 1400s to all the way to the 1600s, where like all through that time frame where people were welcoming it. I guess you could say in a progressive way, like let's welcome it in, and ultimately it ended up in complete British rule. Have you ever seen the movie Black 47?
No, but my bass teacher was in a band called Black 47.
You got to watch the movie Black 47. It's about a young man. It's loosely based on a true story of a young man who basically, well, when I say loosely based, I guess it's a bunch of different stories that they brought together, kind of like Scarface.
Yep.
Scarface is loosely based on a true story.
Right.
You had guys coming over from Cuba during that time when they dumped a bunch of criminals over here, getting their fake green cards, coming in, becoming drug dealers, becoming millionaires, and dying somehow, getting killed. There's no one guy named Tony Montana, but it's loosely based. Same thing with this. And a lot of the movies actually done in Gaelic, which is really, really cool. And it was made, and I want to say it was made in 2018, 2019? 2018.
Guido's on the spot.
Yeah, 2018, 2019. And, well, it got pretty famous in 2019. And, it's about a young man who came back from fighting in battles for the crown abroad. And then, I want to say the Napoleonic Wars, I believe, at the time. And he came back because the famine happened right around 1840s, right around before Lincoln's time here. He basically is coming back to Ireland. He sees Ireland in ruins after him serving the crown, and the crown's basically destroying his homeland. And it's fucking badass. He goes on a tangent, starts killing dudes. It's great. You'd love it, John. It's a very vengeful movie. Yeah.
I love vengeance.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And you have you should watch it tonight. It's and you'll watch it, you'll be like, I just want to go kill some people right now. But dude, the coolest thing is, being an Irishman yourself, it's a lot of it's in Gaelic, so you get to hear the Gaelic language being spoken, and it's really, really cool. There's an Irish movie right now being nominated for an Oscar called Oireachd, which is actually based during the Irish famine times as well. It's not out yet, but I want to say they'll start releasing it soon, but I can't wait for that.
How many people still speak Gaelic? I mean, not an exact number, but is it something that's dying? Is it something that people feel like they need to speak to protect it?
Yeah,
preserve it?
It's back on the increase. It's definitely back on the increase. I mean, I'll give you an example. My parents don't speak the language. They understand it, but they don't speak it. I speak it. Why? Because, so my great-grandfather, who would have been born in 1902, 1903, was a volunteer between 1916 and 1922 in the Irish Revolution. He got medals from like Michael Collins and whatnot. Stayed in the Irish Army up until the 1950s. Obviously, he gave birth to my grandfather. He had, I don't say my grandfather's got like 3 or 4 siblings. My grandfather was born. Then, my great grandfather did speak Gaelic, obviously as a kid, but and it was used during the guerrilla war during the Irish Revolution, because that was one of their ways of kind of the British couldn't really figure them out because everything was done in Gaelic. It's kind of like right now, my Instagram account hasn't been hacked or deleted because I think all my passcodes are all in Gaelic. It's kind of like how during the Second World War
like
they used
wind talker, the Native Americans.
They used the Native American languages to kind of be their passcodes and whatnot, so they couldn't figure it out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe I got to change them now. Anyways, so yeah. So my great grandfather, and then my grandfather moved to England, gave birth to my father in England, and came back. And obviously, my father grew up in England up until he was like 10 or 11. So he obviously came back to Ireland with a big, thick Cockney English accent
Right.
on him, and grew up in Ireland. And you would never think that my father's from England. If you spoke to him, he sounds super Irish. So accent obviously went out pretty quick. But that time in Ireland was like, economy's bad, business, living, whatever about culture. Just let's get this done. And then my father and my mother grew up in an era where um, eventually in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a rise then, the Celtic Tiger, they called it, where the Irish economy was starting to boom. And they were then able to put a focus back on our culture. And I was part of the generation of kids that started being put in Irish speaking or Gaelic speaking schools. And likewise my brother. And then, of course, maybe you could say late 90s, early 2000s, a little bit of a pushback and back and forth. There's always a pushback in Ireland. I mean, this is the thing that blows my mind. I've spoken to many, like, moms in Ireland, and they're like, I want my kid to learn German or French for business and whatnot. And I'm like, well, forget about that for a second. I mean, at what point in time in their life are they ever going to learn German or French? You don't know that until way later on. Not unless you're going to teach them German or French, but you're not. You're probably not going to do that.
Right.
It's very hard to do. You don't speak it. How are you supposed to teach them German or French? Why not raise them on their own language, which is, by the way, their inheritance. It's their inheritance culturally, thousands of years of inheritance. That's their language. And you raise them on English and you raise them on Gaelic. They're going to learn English throughout their environment. And now they're going to be raised on two languages. And when it's a fact that when you grew up on more than one language, your brain is more equipped to take on a second and a third language after that. I mean, for me, languages have always been pretty easy purely because I've grown up on English and Gaelic.
Right.
And like my argument to people is that forget about you wanting your kids to learn a language that's quote unquote useful, which I think is the most retarded thing for someone to say. I mean, in America, one thing I love about America, well, there's an argument to be made nowadays, especially this past year, but at least for the longest time since I've been here, people really want to cling on to their culture.
Right.
And I think it's so important because it's your inheritance. So if you raise your kids on both English and Gaelic, they're going to be more equipped to then learn your whatever the hell language you want them to learn, whether it be German or French or whatever, for business, whether that is what your kid's going to take up anyway. So why not give them the ability to speak? They're going to speak English because of their surroundings, but allow them then to grow up on their cultural inheritance, which is Gaelic. And so there's been pushbacks on that. But in terms of how many people actually speak Gaelic, I believe at one point in time they said that 5% of the population, which our population is roughly about 4.95 million people. So 5% of that population spoke it fluently. I don't know if it's increased now, but that was my understanding a couple of years ago when I looked into it.
But it seems like there's a move for more people to be speaking it and at least preserving it as a cultural aspect.
Yes, correct. It needs to be movies like this movie, Black 47. Obviously a movie being nominated to be to win an Oscar is huge, but it needs something to cling on to that's important. That's why, again, to bring up a friend of mine who's famous in the UFC for fighting. I used to get on McGregor's ass about a little bit about speaking Irish, and he never would. And he would always speak English. And he always somehow, for whatever reason, clinged onto his Dublin side of things. There was one famous time where when he fought Max Holloway here in Boston, he did mention in the press conference that when he was in Peter Welch's gym, I brought him over to Peter Welch's, and then he did his media workout there. And one of my friends, Peter O'Malley, great man, he is from Galway. I don't think he spoke English till he was like 13, this guy. And he met McGregor in the changing rooms because Conor, after he did his workout, he went into the changing rooms and he went and showered, and fucking Peter O'Malley followed him in and started speaking Gaelic to him. And Conor was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
And he said that during the press conference. He was like, yeah, I'm in Boston. I feel at home. This guy came in and started speaking my native tongue to me, which is pretty amazing about Boston. One thing I love about it. But I feel like he could have done a lot more. If Conor had to start speaking Gaelic at some press conference one time, if he'd have really done his homework, and Conor can, because he and I went to school together. We both went to an all Gaelic speaking high school. He can speak it but he kind of chose not to. So I believe that the Irish language needs something cool to tack onto, because when it's just like priests and fucking educators speaking it, like kids are gonna be like, I don't want to fucking.
Nobody
speak
wants to
this.
listen to a priest and an educator. They want to listen to.
I want to listen to someone fucking cool talking about some cool shit.
Right.
So that's why, if you notice, like on my social media, anytime I do a video now, I try to do it all in Gaelic and then put subtitles there, so at least people start hearing it. And then the most amazing thing is that Americans are always the ones to turn around and be like, fuck yeah, this is sick.
Yeah.
I want to learn that. That's like some dope ass shit. And then when you learn about the fact that Brian Boru's grandson was swimming out chasing fucking pussy Vikings onto their boats, you're like,
fucking sword in his mouth.
I want to learn that language.
Yeah. So now we're talking about, like, I want to go back to history because selfishly, I'm fascinated by Irish history, and I'd much rather hear you talk about it than read about it in a book. So now you've got like the 1800s and the English are in Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
And how are things evolving in the late 1800s and early 1900s up into 1916 and those events, which I'm fascinated by?
Well, I'll go on the record and say that, I'm not an absolute expert, right? So, like, I know, I'll tell you at least what I've read and what I know, and give you the general idea. I mean, I'm sure if we had 3 or 4 other Irish guys here who was as fascinated about Irish history as I am and you are, it would be an open conversation. Somebody would probably say stuff that I don't know, so I want that
sounds
to
like
be
a party.
Yeah, it'd be a very good one. So, so I want that to be at least on record in case I say something that maybe, somebody else might point out and be like, but, yeah, I mean, you had you had a ton of Irish revolutionaries, early day revolutionaries who were coming over to the United States. Thomas Marr is a famous one who my friend Paddy Houlihan, shout out to Paddy Houlihan. He's a great man. He's a politician in Ireland right now. Obviously a UFC fighter, had a great career in the UFC, and he ultimately had to retire. But Paddy Houlihan was telling me just mid to late last year that he's reading a book on a guy named Thomas Marr, who was an Irish revolutionary who, next thing you know, found himself in the company of Abraham Lincoln and William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses Grant, talking about the Civil War, fighting in the Civil War. And coming back to Ireland then and telling them, trying to preach to the Irish about his battles and his times in America and their fight for, individual rights and freedoms and taking basically what they went through in their Civil War. And ultimately, Lincoln, who, Lincoln in our culture today, I guess you could say President Obama liked to always tack himself onto Lincoln because Lincoln was known as this guy who freed the slaves and whatnot. But what's not really talked about is how Lincoln, particularly in his Lyceum address in Illinois, 1839 or 1837, I believe, right before his first, right when he was, I believe he was running for president at the time, or was it in the 40s?
What was the name of the address?
The Young Man's Lyceum address in Illinois. I highly recommend anybody read this speech. It's unbelievable. He talks about towering genius. He basically talks about progressivism.
Okay.
And he talks about how they assume themselves to be higher than what's been built for them. He talks about the founding fathers, how we need to continue to build on what the founding fathers have done for us in this country. He basically used the speech to suggest that those looking to secede the Union are going against what was built for us by the founding fathers, and that we need to preserve the Union, and that that there's some sort of this progressive mindset of people who assume themselves to be better than the Constitution or better than what was built for them before them is a bad thing. And people don't often talk. What year was it?
1861 in Springfield, Illinois.
Springfield, Illinois. Yeah. I got my 30s. I was way off. So, you have Lincoln talking about that, and so anyways, you got the likes of Thomas Marr being over here, being amongst those elites, and Grant, of course, is another one who's a great general at the time, going back to Ireland and talking and preaching about the American way and whatnot. The reason why I brought up the Lincoln thing is because he would have heard Lincoln obviously talk about this stuff, and you can imagine that a Thomas Marr going back to Ireland telling people we need to preserve our country too, which obviously sowed the origins for ultimately what went on in 1916 for guys saying, hold on, we need to make a stand here.
So then in 1916, what was triggered in Ireland? What was going on at that time?
Well, obviously with all that stuff that had gone on in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, and with World War One, the Irish obviously felt like it was a good time for them to want to execute an uprising. The only issue is that the uprising was executed by a bunch of poets and writers and scholars, not really military people. God bless them. I mean, they ultimately ended up getting executed, and which led to a military uprising, an actual one that was obviously pioneered and done by Michael Collins, who obviously, unfortunately, in 1922 was then executed himself. Well, he wasn't executed; he was assassinated. That's a layered history. But I would definitely encourage people to look into that. But going on, in 1916, you had a bunch of poets and scholars and, dare I say, socialists, because they were so anti Britain, they were so anti Churchill and the Crown. And Churchill was obviously a very big capitalist-minded individual, and the government at the time was very pro-capitalist. And there's a lot of things economics, when we spoke off air about Thomas Sowell, and there's a lot of things throughout history that can show you the good things that went on in Britain, during the 20s and the 30s and the 40s even, and then that obviously started to slowly decline business-wise and trade and a lot of other things late into the 60s and 70s. Likewise here in America with Lyndon Johnson and all his welfare policies that went in place that kind of slowly but surely started to destroy a lot of our things. But in 1916, you had what was known as the Easter Rising, where they chose a very good time, World War One, to have an uprising, and then with that failed uprising, led a military one done by Michael Collins, which pioneered guerrilla warfare, and that went right up until 1922, and it ultimately gave the Irish a voice. It gave them a voice in Parliament in England. They wanted to have what was so-called a treaty at the time. Let's make a treaty, because the British needed the Americans on their side, and likewise the Irish had a guy named Eamon de Valera who later ended up becoming president of Ireland. He was an American citizen, and he was kind of like their little secret weapon in the beginning, which, funny enough, he ended up being some kind of it's arguably a traitor later on. He's the one who gave the go-ahead to Michael Collins' assassination during the Civil War that we had subsequently after winning a guerrilla war against the British.
Is that time period where the expression black and tans comes from?
Yes, the black and tans were former World War One veterans who were basically sent to Ireland to police the chaos, the so-called chaos at the time. And they were called the black and tans because they were a combination of their their military uniforms and policing uniforms, and they're a mixed bag of chips in color, so they were known as the black and tans.
In uniform, their uniform was a mixed bag.
Uniforms were mixed of war, like army, World War One army style uniforms, along with other uniforms.
Does it ever offend you when you're in a bar and someone orders a black and tan?
No,
because you fucking can't order them in a lot of bars anymore.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's so stupid.
Wait, here in Boston?
Yeah, a lot of places you can't order a black and tan.
It's offensive.
Yeah, it's offensive. So offended.
I'm so offended.
It's also one of my favorite Irish folk songs.
Yeah.
Black and Tans is a great song.
So the Irish folk songs that came from that are unbelievable. I'm sure you've seen the Wolf Tones live. Yeah, they're pretty unbelievable. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot that comes from that. But in terms of the origins of the IRA was what they called themselves was the Irish Republican Army, because they believed themselves to be a legitimate army. That was what our Proclamation of Independence was.
Made up of mostly Catholics?
Pretty much all Catholics, yeah. In 1916. So we were between 1960 and 1922, we were known as the Irish Republican Army because we recognized ourselves as a sovereign, and De Valera, printed that out, sent it to America and other countries to say that we're an independent state. Obviously, the Crown didn't recognize it, the British didn't recognize it, and then obviously that ensued then up until 1922, until there was the so-called, what we call the treaty, which led to our Civil War.
That's a very turbulent time, and it's
very turbulent. It pitted brother against brother, family against family, father against son. It was a very brutal time.
Because people in the same household had differing opinions on if they should be loyal to the Crown or loyal to
Likewise,
the
what we have now in America, you got people in the same household. Some people who are in favor of these, progressive leftist movements, and then you've got people who are just not.
Yeah. When I was, like I said, it was about a decade ago when I was in Ireland, but it still seemed like it was a very, very sensitive subject over there, this time period.
I would argue that the sensitivity of this subject comes from a lack of knowledge about it.
Mhm.
I would argue that the sensitivity of any subject comes from a lack of knowledge because for me at least, if I'm sitting down with somebody, and just an example, if we're talking about modern day politics in America, the people who oftentimes get more sensitive or more, they don't want to talk about it are people who don't know a lot about the subject. They're going off of what they feel is right. And, you might mention one or two things, whether it be factual or not, it may be factual and they just don't want to hear it. So I think if you go to Ireland right now, and especially over a couple of drinks, and you ask somebody about 1916 or you ask them about what went on in Ireland, it'll become quite sensitive purely because of a lack of knowledge about it. And I think people are not really open towards it. I mean, like I said, I've grandfathers on both sides of the family. My great grandfather, who's on my father's side, and my grandfather on my mother's side, they were actually the same age, believe it or not. My mother's father is the same age as my great grandfather on my father's side, and they were both volunteers during 1916 all the way up to 1922, and lived on well on after that and kept on going. My great grandfather, I know, stayed in the army. My mother's father, my grandfather, my mother's side, not so much. And I'm open to talking about it. I'm open to talk about anything, really. If you can give me something that's convincing or that's, relatively based in fact or logic, I'll hear it. But I think, like you said, when you go to Ireland, you talk about certain topics, particularly about that time, you've got people who don't know too much about it, and they'll want to believe what they want to believe. And sorry, not to cut off, one of the main things for me is what went on in Ireland between the 60s and the 90s, which led to the Good Friday Agreement. People would argue to the death that it was right, and then people argue to the death that it was wrong.
What is the Good Friday Agreement? The
Good Friday Agreement was basically a treaty, or it was a treaty that was facilitated by the United States under the Clinton administration, which was between the United Kingdom and Ireland, that would cause a ceasefire of the respective groups like the IRA. And the Protestant groups involved that were basically causing all the violence in the north of Ireland, leading to bombings.
So that was still going on in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s.
And the 90s. And, you had bombings, you had shootings, you had, all kinds of things going on.
You also can't order a car bomb in a bar anymore either.
Yeah, I mean, that's just
so sensitive.
Ridiculous. It's so sensitive.
I find that, when you're talking about a lot of these topics, like you said, you have to be willing to have your mind changed in order to really be able to engage in a good conversation with people. And that's when you're using a little bit more of your intellectual capacity. It's when people are too emotionally attached to something, they're not willing to have their mind changed.
Correct.
And that's when you get really, really heated exchanges between people who maybe have less information on the subject matter, and they're more arguing based on how they feel about it, not what they think about it.
My least favorite thing to hear in a social setting is, let's change the subject. Why? Why do we have to change the subject? And I always find myself on the receiving end of that remark.
It's the person who's about to be wrong who says that.
Right.
Let's change the subject.
Let's change the subject.
Because I'm just going to regurgitate some memes that I saw, and you might blast me out with some facts.
Or it could touch on some feel. But isn't that the whole point of a good discussion? What good thing never came out of somebody's feelings being slightly hurt? And also, too, like to quote Thomas Jefferson, I would never, want to lose a friend over a disagreement on religion or politics. You should be, as friends, you should be able to talk about these things. It doesn't matter whether it be about race, it doesn't matter whether it be about religion or politics. You should be able to talk about these things. But my least favorite thing to hear is, let's change the subject.
And I know groups of people right now, and considering the political climate today in America, I know friends that don't speak right now because they're on different sides of the argument, and because people are so emotionally attached. And let's be honest, the politicians and the media don't do us any favors by their lack of providing objective news and fact reporting. So they don't really do anybody any favors. But it's definitely a difficult topic
I even have
people.
friends right now. The amount of people that I've seen their posts come up my Instagram on my Facebook. Now, I can have a little bit of a fiery Instagram and Facebook every now and again, but I'm okay with it. But the amount of times that I've come across people, let's say, okay, on Facebook, if somebody unfriends you, you both unfriend each other. It's, but on Instagram, if somebody unfollows you, you don't know until maybe you just check. And the amount of times I've had people who I literally were like, I was like, I thought we were good. Right. And you see that they don't want to deal with you. And it's literally comes down to the fact that, like, I had someone the other day who unfollowed me, and I messaged them, and I know them, and I said, hey, I won't put them on blast, but I was like,
it's a safe zone, bro. You can talk anything.
Yeah. Well, I won't put them on blast, but I'll be at least like, hey, I thought we were cool. And they were like, I don't like some of the stuff you're posting. It's not funny to me. And they were like, and I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, and it was about Trump. And they were like, well, if you support Trump and he puts down people of color and all this kind of stuff. And I just went, you know what? I just responded. I said, if you truly believe that the president puts down people of color or women, that's an ignorance that I'm happy to part with. Because it's pure ignorance. It's such a pure ignorance statement to make. And people, like you said, are feeding off of this, narrative of I'm going to just ingest everything that's given to me by way of one form of media. So like you said, yes, it is. It's unfortunate that you have people that don't even talk. But
it's also, that's a passive aggressive power play. They don't want to follow your Instagram posts regardless of whatever you might post. But also, it's bad for them because it creates more of an echo chamber for them. Now they're not getting an alternative viewpoint, and they don't need to agree with what you say, but they should be open to hearing it. And it's difficult to convey a well thought out message over an Instagram meme, but it does contribute to people only hearing the information that they already confirm in their own minds. Right.
And isn't it funny then when, let's say, conservative groups initially turned to Parler because they were getting censored and blocked and even silenced on the likes of the mainstream liberal media like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And then they have the nerve to then turn around and say, oh, that's a conservative echo chamber. Well, no, actually, we were all happy integrating and sharing ideas and conveying our ideologies with you online. But you guys celebrated us being censored. You guys reported. Like my Facebook post, I can't even start a group now on Facebook. Like Facebook told me the other day, you were indefinitely suspended from forming groups. You were indefinitely suspended from starting events. Like there was a whole bunch of shit that they hit me for. And I'm like, that's all down to somebody or people, multiple people most likely saying, fuck this guy. So then why do you think we would turn to something else? And then that gets shut down itself. Anyway, that's another story.
Well, I mean, it's worth talking about because I feel like
Let's change the subject. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, my viewpoint is that all these views should be represented and have the ability to be represented. But the flip side of the argument is that people unfortunately don't want to hear is no one's breaking any laws by censoring these people. These are private entities, unfortunately. And as the First Amendment right now doesn't say that you're entitled to be on Facebook. It doesn't say anything like that. So at the end of the day, while it's unfortunate for people, and I think in the long run, it's detrimental to the well-being of the country and to the mental health of a lot of people who kind of live inside these echo chambers. I don't think they're breaking any laws. I think that if the laws change now, and should the laws change, I don't know. I'm not nearly smart enough to tell you what should be on a social media platform and what shouldn't be. But I just feel like voluntarily you should seek out alternative opinions to your own voluntarily.
100%.
And social media is encouraging people to not do that.
Absolutely. And the scary thing is about social media, and I said to a guy the other day, I said, if Teddy Roosevelt was around right now, or even, heck, let's go back to George Washington, and they had like a big tech thing. What do you think a president like that would do? They'd probably take the U.S. military and confiscate them and be like, you're an absolute threat to national security and the Constitution of the United States. And the only thing that makes it scary, this guy was like, well, it's a private company. I don't know if you guys follow Tim Pool. He's got some great stuff. He was like, well, BP then can have their own oil spills. And you should start your own company if you want to clean it up. You know? Oh, wait. Yeah. Oh, what's that you say? We should have government regulations to make sure that these guys don't spill oil into the ocean? Oh, why didn't you say so? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
and like, I thought that was a great analogy, but it's like the alarming thing for me when it comes to social media and what's going on is that it's absolutely apparent that there is government collusion with these social media big tech companies in censoring one side. Like, it's amazing that, Biden can go around, or his administration, or whoever part of his Twitter or whatever, whoever controls this thing, can go around and keep repeating the false narratives of Trump when he says that, the Charlottesville thing. But they always forget that when Trump said there was good people on both sides, and I'm not talking about the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis because they should be condemned wholeheartedly and absolutely. They always cut that part out.
Right.
He talks about there was good people on both sides, and they run with that. But there's no Twitter labeling on that. There's no fact checkers, So it's like the alarming thing for me about social media nowadays is that there is a clean cut collusion between government and these social media tech companies. And you look at now, obviously, we're in a time where the Democrats are potentially going to control the Senate and the House and the presidency. It's like it's going to be at no end. And so I agree with your point that, a private company is separate to, let's say, quote unquote, the First Amendment. But when government is colluding with it, celebrating the censorship of other people, that changes the playing field a little bit, because the First Amendment is supposed to be to suggest that Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech. And the word abridge, I don't think people really realize, is very important. The word abridge means to shorten or curtail. They chose that word very specifically when they wrote the First Amendment. Abridge means to shorten or curtail, meaning to say you can have free speech, but it can't be hateful. Well, isn't the whole point of free speech is to be able to say things that makes people feel uncomfortable or that they may not like? That's the whole point behind free speech, and they don't want that.
I don't know. The whole free speech thing kind of like irks me. All this nonsense about offensive speech. We grew up in an age where, you got insulted as a little kid and you were taught to recite, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And now it seems like kids are brought up the other way. Like, no, names are the things that are really going to hurt me. I don't want to go off on like a First Amendment thing because we have other things I want to talk to you about. But I do believe that rather than everyone being injured and hurt and being stressed out and gaining a disorder from a stressful time, we need to concentrate on allowing people to learn how to grow from those periods. We constantly talk about people having post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a real thing, and people suffer from that. But we very rarely talk about or champion the people that have post-traumatic stress growth, the people that get stronger from it. When you go and lift weights, in theory, you're supposed to get stronger because your body overcompensates for the stress that you put on it.
Correct.
We should be raising...
And
fighting. And we should be raising people to have that same mentality. When there's a stress put on you emotionally or mentally, we need to teach people to get stronger from that stress rather than to go into a corner and cry and say, "I don't want anyone coming around me," or any of that other shit.
But you know what? I just touching on what we were just talking about there. It is incredible, the free speech thing, because you've got people that like literally will come out and say, "Well, let's celebrate that the fact that the president was taken off of Twitter, and let's celebrate all this stuff." And they
don't have any concept of what a precedent is.
They don't have any concept of that.
It's going to happen to their party in another 8 years.
It'll eventually come back to bite you. Kind of like how BLM, who are open, you've had many people openly say, yeah, socialism, Marxism is great. And then what's happening now? You've got all the local BLM chapters all around the country complaining, writing cohesive letters, arguing, complaining, giving out to the central BLM people for hoarding all the donations. And it's like, that's Marxism and communism in full effect right there. Yeah. They are complaining that all the donations are going to the main people and it's not being redistributed out. And it's funny, I just want, while we're on this subject, because a big word that gets tossed about during this whole concept of censorship, and again, like I always refer to that word that I think was chosen very well by the framers and the founding fathers of the Constitution, that is the abridging of free speech, is the word fascism. And people like to throw it about big time. And what is fascism? Fascism is basically, it doesn't matter whether you have pink hair or whether you have a tight comb over and shaved sides. It doesn't matter, because people always associate fascism being with Nazis. And if you were to Google fascism right now,
Google it, Guido.
It will say that it's a far right It's a far right concept or ideology. And actually, I actually have an argument. It is true. And I actually argue this. I'm like, if we were to look at the political spectrum right now, what is left versus right? Well, if you go left, if you go from the center left, you start to hit more government, more regulation. And the train of thought is we've all been taught maybe throughout history is that you hit communism when you go far left. And that we've also been taught in school that when you go far right, you hit fascism. Well, what is fascism? Fascism doesn't matter whether you have pink hair or a comb over, like I alluded to earlier on. It's forcing people to conform to your beliefs by way of violence or by way of like imprisonment or torture or whatever. And actually, if you look at history, there's a very interesting one, Guido, which you won't find on Google, which is amazing. If you look at history, fascism actually has only ever been implemented by far left governments. Okay, because actually the political spectrum, if you look at it, if you go left, you hit more government. And the idea is that when you go right, you hit less government. How is it that fascism is a so-called right-wing ideology if the further you go right, you hit less government when you need actually way more government influence and power to implement a fascist concept?
Isn't that a prime example of the Horseshoe Theory?
The Horseshoe Theory, yeah. I've heard a bit that it's I've understand that concept of that the political spectrum is not a straight line; it's more like a horseshoe. But here's the thing I want to really convey is that fascism, it's neither a form of government or it's neither a form of government or economic or an economic ideology or an economic system. It's neither a form of government or an economic system. Fascism is a set of ideologies that was actually pioneered by Mussolini, which is that we should use government to force our ideologies onto our people to make them conform to what we want them to be, so they work in orderly fashion, and that they work in orderly fashion that we can control them. But what do you need in order for that to happen? You need a large, influential, and powerful government. You look at Hitler. Hitler used his SS and his SA to really implement that. Ultimately, the SS to implement those. You had the Gestapo. You had all these different forms of government-funded policing that led to him being able to really, really grip that. And Mussolini, likewise, he used similar things. That's why they were good friends. But again, I always challenge people, when you toss around this concept that fascism is somehow a right-wing ideology, it's not. Just because they had clean comb-overs doesn't mean that, that all of a sudden you come to America and that Republicans have clean comb-overs and they believe in conservatism and being neat and whatnot. That doesn't mean that it's fascist. Fascism actually, if you look throughout history, only lays on far-left governments. And the Nazis were actually... it was the National Socialist Workers' Party. They believed in large welfare. They believed in universal healthcare, universal education. They believed Hitler ran on a wealth disparity, racial inequality, because he assumed and he preached to the German people that the Jews were the 1%ers with all the money.
Guido's Jewish.
So likewise is my girlfriend. And my kids will be as well. But, well, because,
we have a representative.
Yeah. So I'm saying that Hitler ran on the concept that the Jews were the 1%ers and that they own all the money. What do we see nowadays? So the white people are the one, the 1%ers. When Bernie Sanders was running, and he's Jewish, millionaires were the enemy. But then when he became a millionaire, all of a sudden it's the billionaires.
Right.
So the point that I was trying to make is going off what we were just talking about is that this concept of what we've grown to, this term fascism that gets tossed around, and that you got people on the left, particularly anybody who's anti-Trump, celebrating censoring the president and celebrating censoring anybody that is like on, let's say, quote unquote, the right. The right in America means less government. We want them to get off our back, like the Reagan era style people that we talk about, or the Roosevelt people. Let us have. We talked about Thomas Sowell when we were off air, like the concept of less government regulation. But I just thought it was very, important to mention that the fact that this concept of fascism, it's not a far right ideology. It's actually a far left, because how can it be a far right ideology when it's only ever been implemented by far left governments throughout history?
According to the great internet resource Wikipedia, the horseshoe theory in political science and popular discourse, the horseshoe theory asserts that the far left and the far right, rather than being at opposite and opposing ends of a linear political continuum, closely resemble one another, analogous to the way that the opposite ends of a horseshoe are close together. So I feel like we kind of approach that.
Well, for me, you know what, my I don't believe in a horseshoe, or I actually believe that it's a circle, because I think that when you go very far left, you hit full-blown communism, which, well, it's hard to get out of full-blown communism, but it ultimately may or may not end up in a revolt. But one thing that is for sure is that you could almost say that the spectrum can only go right. And what I mean by that is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you go very far left and you give all the control to government, it's pretty hard to escape that. But when you go all the way right, according to what we know of the political spectrum of the political horseshoe, is that you go right, you hit less government, you eventually hit anarchy, which ultimately ends up leading to communism. Because when you eventually hit anarchy, someone or something, you could almost argue that Napoleon is a product of anarchy. When, during the French Revolution, when they got sick of the French monarchy and the people decided to say, fuck this, we're going to take these people out and execute them. And that's where the guillotine became very famous. And then who was a product of that kind of anarchy or that vacuum? And that was Napoleon. He became a dictator. And essentially it led to, Napoleon's dictatorship led to what you would essentially interpret as fascist and, somewhat communist style government. I've got friends of mine who will argue to the death that Napoleon is one of the great figures in history, and I wouldn't deny it. I'm just saying that the French Revolution is an example of when you hit pure anarchy and you eliminate the monarchy and all those in charge, what happens? It becomes a vacuum, and you end up with one complete power. So I believe that in some regards that it becomes a circle, but the Soviet Union just had to fail and break up on its own in order for it to be done. It didn't result in any one necessary group of people that said, let's overthrow the government, because it's impossible. They've got a hand in everything. You can't get away from it. Especially as long as Stalin was alive, you couldn't get away from it. But I think it's very important. When you Google fascism, it assumes that it's a right-wing ideology, when that in fact is wholeheartedly incorrect, because when you look at fascism, it's only ever implemented. I mean, look at Franco in Spain. It's one of my favorite things to argue when it comes to my European friends who turn around to me and they criticize Americans for owning guns in America. Oh, how can you guys own guns in America? And I'm like, well, how can you guys produce 6 dictators in the 20th century alone?
What are you shooting these days?
Nothing. They don't shoot at all.
No, you.
Oh, me. I try and shoot as much as I try and shoot like everything from like a fucking 12 gauge to a 5.56 all the way up to the 50 cal. But I'm saying,
do you have an LTC here?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Do you?
Yeah. You carry?
Not on me right now, but I like to as often as I can. Yeah.
I have an LTC. I don't carry though. I figure in almost any, because I'm not trained in anything other than aiming at a stationary target at the range and shooting it. I just feel like my best bet if I have an altercation with anybody is still going to be to use my hands.
I believe that, and I believe that to be true. I believe 90% of the time it is going to result to hands. However, not over the summer, there was a couple of events where nights where I chose to walk my dog, whether it be like on a Saturday or Sunday. It just so happened that I walked them earlier and I went and I hung out with some people and I came back and I got calls off of friends of mine who were cops and they were at homicides right by my area. I almost walked right into a shooting one night. It was not long. It was in the middle of June. I believe it was like June 15th. I was walking out and I stopped in this alleyway to light my cigar. And had I continued as I usually continued, I would have walked right into the middle of a shooting that just happened.
Carrying at that point isn't going to help you out. If you accidentally walk into a shooting,
correct.
Carrying's not going to, it's not
correct. If I accidentally walk into a shooting, that's correct. But had I walk out to the scene, I mean, maybe caught in the crossfire is one thing, but what if at some point someone turns to look at me and my dog and considers me? Well, that's the thing. I was about to say, you're familiar with the term shadow boxing.
Yeah.
One of my good friends, he's a Navy SEAL, and he told me that almost 85, 90% of the time, they're not actually shooting. They're not actually discharging ammo. They're shadowing. They're basically shadow boxing. And he turned and he goes, think about it. When you're shadow boxing, you're working on your footwork, your hand movement, your this, that, and the other, so that when you get in the ring, you visualize all these things. And he was explaining to me that in the SEALs, they do almost all shadowing with their firearms, meaning drawing, reloading, boom, boom, figuring out jab, with no ammo, sometimes maybe not even a magazine, or if the magazine is in, the only thing that's in the magazine is a bunch of casings, not even bullets.
Right.
And you're shadowing different things. And I more often than not, then I go to, I mean, the most rounds that I'll shoot will be shotgun rounds because I like to shoot trap a lot. But I'll shadow my AR, I'll shadow my pistol, I'll shadow my pistol from my carry position, I'll shadow it all. I'll shadow my timing from what it would put on different clothing. I'll shadow what it takes for me to lift my jacket, get the thing out, or unloop my holding, get the gun out and rack. Because I'll be honest with you, I have many friends that like to carry with a round in the chamber as well as what they have. I'm a little funky about that because when you've a round in the chamber, you always...
anything can go wrong.
And God forbid, I like to carry my gun a little bit more...
Shoot your balls off, dude.
I like to carry my gun a little bit more the front so I could shoot my dick off. Yeah. So I like to shadow drawing my firearm, racking, and going from there.
There's an art, I think it's called Iaido Jiu-Jitsu or Iaido Jitsu. And it's just the art of drawing and sheathing the katana, the sword.
That's why those guys are so good. Yeah. Have you ever seen the video of they had this samurai? It's actually pretty recent. I want to say it happened in like 2011 or 2013. This guy, he stood like 15 feet from a pitching machine, and the balls were like, they had an infrared gun, and the balls were coming out like 120 miles an hour or something like that. And the guy just stood there on a podium like 15 feet from this thing, and he watched one or two go by, and then he just sat there and drew his sword, and then a ball came out and he sliced it in half.
Get Guido, verify that. I don't buy that.
It's stupid.
15 feet at 120 miles an hour?
It's retarded.
That's got to be like a 20th of a second reaction time.
Just Google samurai slicing baseball, and it'll pop up, and watch the gun. Watch the video, and then you can watch it, and then it's retarded. And this guy, and it all comes... I mean,
he's definitely not doing it if Jacob deGrom is throwing it.
It all comes down to that science of, like you said, drawing, re-putting, drawing, re-putting, drawing, re-racking.
Right.
And this is the concept that my friend, who I said is a Navy SEAL, was I won't mention his name because, he'd rather stay inconspicuous. I don't even know where he is right now. I haven't seen him for a couple months. But...
it's on the internet. It's got to be true.
Does it look real?
Watch the video while we talk. Watch the video while we talk, and then you can let us know what they put a close up on the gun. It was like 125 or
100 mile an hour fast.
I'm gonna research this when
it's retarded.
Here.
It's retarded.
It cuts it right in half, and they show the baseball.
They show. It's stupid. How you can and he sits there with the sword fully in the thing, and then boom, like second the ball comes out, boom, slices it in half. There's
So here's my thing. The entire idea of what makes someone good at hitting Major League Baseball is less the reaction time and more the memory of their eye being able to judge the path of the ball over years and years and years and years of doing this. And I think at 60 feet, 6 inches, I think a Major League fastball at 90 miles an hour, you have less than a quarter of a second to see that pitch coming and decide whether or not to even start your motion to swing the bat at the ball. So that would be something.
So wait, you're telling me it was, what was the speed that was on the gun? They have a close up of the gun. Show me the
100 miles an hour.
But see if you can get to the frame when you're scrolling through the video. See if you can get to the frame where it shows that they zoom in on the gun of the ball that he sliced in half.
So
I want to know because I thought it was more than 100 when I watched it.
Then there's one with this guy's cutting BB pellets.
Okay, that's ridiculous. But the baseball one.
But that's believable.
That video that you just watched where he's at ease, like it turns to the gun right after.
Yeah, it's I need to find a better quality video because that one it was a little bit blurry when they actually did the
Okay, fine. But do me a favor. All I want to know is just because I want to know if I'm correct or not. find the video, and then when the camera goes to the gun, and I thought it was over 100 miles an hour. I thought it was like 110 or 115 or something. I may be wrong.
Well, either way, it's impressive. But while Guido researches that, I do want to bring up, now that we're talking about Samurai, that today is the 12-year anniversary of your UFC debut.
Okay, yeah.
The first Irishman to fight in the UFC. What was that journey like for a 20-year-old kid from Ireland to make it to that level of competition?
So the crazy thing is about that day was that I had only actually started competing in MMA less than a year and a half before that. So to all of a sudden be at the press conference, which was on the Thursday, before, obviously the weigh-ins were on the Friday and then the fight was on the Saturday. But to be at the press conference on the Thursday and to be sitting amongst Shogun, Rua, Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson, Mark Coleman, I mean, it was retarded. Like just to my right alone, I was at the very end. I had Marcus Davis, then I had Shogun Rua, and then I had Dan Henderson. I mean, like, talk about at that time, 2009. I mean, 2008, 2007, 2006. Everybody was watching Pride, UFC. Like,
Sunday night.
You're looking at like Pride guys, UFC guys, and I'm like, what the fuck am I doing here? What the fuck am I doing here? I was like, Jesus fuck. I'm like, this is fucking insane. But at the same time, I had to just be like, well, you're here now.
Well, what was your background? If you'd only been training MMA for a short time, what was your background leading up to that?
Well, I grew up on karate, and shout out to my sensei, Roy Baker. He was the one who took me all to my sport karate career. And, still, concepts of martial arts but more so the discipline of preparing and competing. Majority of it would come from Roy Baker, and also to another guy that Roy introduced me to, which is a guy named Jimmy Upton, who was one of Crumlin Boxing Gym's great boxers at heavyweight, and he was also a kickboxer. And then obviously through John Kavanagh. John Kavanagh was a hell of a competitor himself in jiu-jitsu and grappling and MMA himself. So like I'd obviously had a good lineage, but the one thing that I was lacking at the time was a good wrestling background. It was all jits and striking. I didn't have that bridge.
Well, historically, the UK was not known for wrestling at that time, right? And that's kind of changing now as MMA has spread in popularity. But when you think of like Ireland and the UK, and you don't necessarily associate that area with wrestling as much as
you
do
associated with boxing and striking and kickboxing and even Muay Thai. But yeah, it just so happened that on the night my opponent had a good, strong wrestling background. That was ultimately what led me to losing that fight. And so I was on a mission then to just like learn the discipline of wrestling. And I have to say, over the years, if I'm to have kids, the probably the first two disciplines they're gonna learn is wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and like against other kids, like, and then I'll teach them striking along the way. Striking is like striking. I feel like there's a reason why you see like soccer players or even golfers or ball players like baseball make very good strikers, because it's all on the ball. You're looking at the ball. There's something very small, and you got to make contact with it. It's very small. Tennis players make good strikers as well. People who grew up playing tennis.
Also, the hip rotation creates the power.
Hip rotation, the power, but that hand-eye coordination of seeing a small ball and making it work. I'd obviously have them play all those sports, but I have to say, like, wrestling and jiu-jitsu were two things that, boy or girl, I would have them grow up on.
Well, wrestling's the greatest sport in the world.
I think, it's probably one of the oldest and the greatest.
It is the oldest sport, and a lot of people will say, no, running is the oldest sport in the world. To which I say, what do you think people were running from? Wrestlers. and that's the truth.
That's the best thing I've ever fucking heard. What do you think people were running from? It is the absolute truth, and I would wholeheartedly agree that if I was to put a single discipline on, like I said, male, if I would have two kids right now, male and female, they'll be wrestling each other.
Yeah.
I don't give a fuck. Like, they'll be wrestling each other. Because if you look at we both know this concept of MMA, of wrestlers who've gotten in, who've perfected like the striking arts. It's like there's such. I mean, isn't it amazing that we're both jiu-jitsu fanatics, you and I. You're an incredible jiu-jitsu practitioner, and you've produced so many amazing people in jiu-jitsu. But isn't it amazing that you and I will both sit here and agree that, one guy like will win with a crazy submission and people be yelling jiu-jitsu, but then like 6 of the UFC world champions are all wrestling based guys. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah, I think there's a reason for that. And I think that I can only speak to American wrestling and the way that American wrestlers grow up in a structured sport. The huge benefit is that when you're a wrestler, you have a season. So as a little kid, if you start to wrestle, this is what happened to me. Wrestling is really hard. And I didn't want to do it. And I wanted to quit. And my dad said, you don't have to quit. You're not going to quit, but you don't have to do it next season. And the issue outside of that with going to a striking gym or going to a martial arts gym is there is no season. So if you don't like what you're doing, your dad can't tell you, make it to the end of the season and decide to do something else next year. If you quit, you're just a quitter. And now you're learning how to be a quitter as a little kid. And I think that the structure and the fact that wrestling, when you wrestle, no one does it as a workout. No one does it as a hobby. Competition is the only goal in mind. So as you filter people out of the process, as you grow older and grow older, there are no hobbyists. Like, you see some like people who go to an MMA gym and they do it to lose weight. And then someone convinces them to do a couple smokers. And then someone convinces them to do an amateur fight and a pro fight. And it's like, now all of a sudden you're 28, 29, and you're doing a professional fight when all you wanted to do was lose weight. And it might not be congruent. The physical competition may not be congruent with your mental situation at the time, whereas a wrestler is geared towards competition. We are here to compete. You know what the end goal is. And I think that type of structure and that type of discipline and determination, it just translates to other things. And yes, the wrestling techniques are really positive and have a huge impact on your ability to win an MMA fight, but it's the intangible things that come with growing up as a wrestler, I think, that really lead to success in the cage. The
dominant competitive spirit that they preach, like, don't give up that position. Let's go. Like, you see guys in high school. I mean, one of my favorite things to watch is high school wrestling. And you got 16, 17-year-olds who are like, not letting go of that single. I mean, they'll be so sprawled on with their arms are like behind their fucking head. Like, they're like, all like, you think their scapula is gonna blow out, and they fucking somehow manage to scramble to their feet. They hold it. Like, it's incredible.
Well, that's a problem with jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu's biggest problem is there's an attitude of concession when it comes to positional dominance. If someone's in on your leg, it's okay that they take you down because you're able to play guard from your back. But when I started jiu-jitsu, it was intrinsically tied to real fighting. It's not so much anymore because sport jiu-jitsu has evolved to a certain degree. But the attitude of concession betrays them when they try and convert modern jiu-jitsu to MMA. Just because you can play off your back doesn't mean you should play off your back, especially when someone is punching you in the face.
I 100% agree.
Doesn't mean that people can't translate modern jiu-jitsu to MMA, because plenty of them do. But I think that the attitude in jiu-jitsu, where you get a lot of people looking to get in shape, you get a lot of people who don't care. I mean, my gym has 375 people in it. And I mean, what's the percentage of people that are competing? What do we got? 7 competitors out of the whole gym? And we probably like avid competitors that are, I mean, not people who are just going to go do a tournament because they want to measure their success, but people who are dedicated to trying to get to the highest level. And there's a difference, and one is not better than the other. But I think that that's a huge issue in jiu-jitsu, an attitude of concession. When you run a jiu-jitsu gym, it's difficult because in a tournament, no one's conceding. But in a training center or in a training environment, people concede all the time. And so you kind of give your training partners or your gym opponents a false sense of what real competition or real combat will be like. Someone gets in on your leg and you flop to your butt and you decide to play half guard, that's fine. You just robbed your opponent or your training partner of the opportunity to learn how to actually finish that single leg when someone's trying to resist them. So I think I don't want to get off on a tangent on what's right and what's wrong with all the
I think you and I completely agree with the whole doctrine of, the wrestling mindset versus the jiu-jitsu mindset when it comes to training. I mean, I try and preach to my guys. I'm like, just like you said, don't end up on your back. The only reason why you're on your back is because you ended up there.
Right.
It's that shouldn't be by choice.
But the modern rules of MMA have changed that outlook. So think of it like this. I was watching the fights yesterday where someone was saying, you never want to be on your back with a strong wrestler inside your guard. That's only true because of the rules of modern MMA. That's only true because we have 3 rounds and the judges are looking at positional scoring in a time where techniques are a little bit different. And so years and years ago, when there was no judges scoring, it was either there was a finish or it was a draw.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a strong wrestler inside your guard, and when there's no judges scoring to worry about, and that guy's trying to finish you, it means he's creating space to punch, and he's giving you the space to work jiu-jitsu from the bottom side.
Mm-hmm.
But when they're riding positions out because they know that they're scoring points in the judge's mind, that's when jiu-jitsu off your back doesn't really have a chance to work. Jiu-jitsu doesn't work in 3 seconds. You need to take time. And
Correct.
The person on top has to be engaging you. The guard is a defensive position by nature. That the name of the word guard is a defensive word.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of the guard is to not get punched in a real fight.
Mm-hmm.
When people on top of you try and punch you, they're giving space for you, and that provides you opportunities to create and attempt submissions. Rules of modern MMA don't really afford you that luxury, so I think things are a little bit different now. But
you're right, especially when it comes to the judging and whatnot, that obviously gears a little bit more towards the top guy. You know, I mean, I think it'll be interesting when eventually, when MMA evolves a little bit more, like we've seen, you know, boxing evolve to the point where the likes where you have like a Floyd Mayweather who's getting scored based on his defensive boxing.
right.
We don't really have that in MMA right now, where you're getting scored based on your defensive jiu-jitsu, or you're, you know, defending a submission or defending a position, or even getting certain reversals. You know, you could spend 3 minutes on your back, get a reversal, and potentially out of that 5-minute round, the guy who spent 3 minutes on top is going to get the favorable decision. Depends on how they want to view it.
He can be on top for 3 minutes, do no damage. The bottom player creates a sweep, which is an offensive technique, and is only on top for 30 seconds. The first guy will win that round based on what they'll call like control time, which is kind of a misnomer because most of the judges don't even know what control time means. And they don't know who's really controlling who. I can put someone in my guard and say, hey, punch me as many times as you can in the next 3 minutes, and they'll never punch me. I'm actually controlling them from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they're on top doesn't mean they're in control. But I mean, you know the deal. The judges for athletic commissions are political positions. They're not athletic positions.
Right. It's going to be really interesting to see. And I guess we're just kind of subject to time when it comes to MMA and which way it plays, you know, which way it goes. I kind of like how Chris Lieben has been like an MMA referee.
Yeah, Lieben. I think like who else is doing it? Frank Trigg.
Right.
And I think Ricardo Almeida is doing judging in New Jersey. So
I like that a lot.
We need more of that.
We need more of that. And I think eventually, but here's my only thing. And I get the people, eventually when MMA evolves a little bit more, it'll be really interesting when we see judging, you know, shift a little bit. But my only thing is, like, I think this is where I was going at earlier, was that if you or I were judges in MMA, it'll be a lot different than like we talked about a Chris Lieben or a Frank Trigg being a judge. We don't know what they're going to score their favorites of. Imagine Conor McGregor being a judge, or a Nate Diaz being a judge.
Very subjective.
Very subjective. They're going to gear towards what they feel is what the winner is. What they feel is the winner is versus, which is, I guess you could say, for me personally, I mean, you might have a different opinion than I do on this, but when I hear the likes of Rogan and a couple of other, you know, big voices in MMA go off about judging and whatnot, particularly when it comes to certain fights, I oftentimes revert to the concept of, well, whoever we have judging may not be MMA fighters, but maybe is that a good thing, in the sense that they're being told what to judge and what to look for, versus you, like Rogan, for example. Rogan might be like, you know, how many times, I mean, I don't know about you, but me personally, I don't particularly like Joe Rogan's commentary in MMA fight. He sucks one guy's dick when he's winning. and he sucks the other guy's dick when he comes back. It's
Okay.
like I don't feel like
That's fair.
for me, I don't feel like there's any one. And I felt like that when the likes of DC and Cruz first started, they had very good, even commentary. They would come. If you watch a ball game, we talked about baseball and football off air. Oftentimes when you watch baseball commentary, they're commenting on what's happening. They're not commenting like, oh, well, now there's this guy and, like.
Well, let me push back on that.
Okay, no problem.
When you watch a baseball game, there are two teams, and each team has a set of announcers. And depending on what station you're watching, you're going to get a different representation.
That's
true. It might not be as blatant or as over the top as you get it sometimes in MMA. And I'm not disagreeing with you, because I do think that does happen in MMA. But in baseball, so I have the MLB package. Big shout out to MLB. Maybe they want to sponsor the show. Not sure.
That'd be great.
But when the Mets are playing, say, the Braves, the Mets announcing, which is the best in the business, is very different than the Braves announcers. And there are what we call homers in baseball announcing, the guys who are always rooting for the home team. But I do agree with you to an extent on the judging. I also think that one of my things that I hate to hear in fighting is don't leave it up to the judges. Really? Why? Why are they there then? We should be able to leave it up to the judges. The fact that you're saying we can't leave it up to the judges, all you're really saying is the judges are either incompetent or the training of the judges is incompetent. Because I shouldn't have to go into a fight and worry about my opponent and the judges. I know judges, especially locally, who are a little bit, less than scrupulous. And, I'm sure it happens on high levels. And if you ever listen to the podcast, I think it was with maybe Teddy Atlas, and he was on Rogan, and I think he was talking about corrupt judges in boxing. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. I think there are pros and cons to open scoring. I know some people like it, some people don't like it. I think the 10-point must system works in boxing because it was designed for a 15-round fight, later reduced to 12-round fight, where if you lose 2 rounds, the other opponent still has 10 other rounds to win to make that up. So even if the judge makes a mistake, or even if it's kind of an errant score for a round, a competitor can still make that up. You judge a round incorrectly twice in MMA, and someone's screwed. They're never coming back from that unless they can score a finish, which is harder and harder to do. Do you love MMA still?
Of course. Oh, yeah, of course I love MMA. And in fact, part of the reason why I love MMA is because we are still in this unique time of evolving. We can just because the UFC is so popular and we have your McGregors or we've had your John Joneses and we have our Adesanyas and stuff right now. We're still kind of in your Ali era of boxing right now. We're still in your early days of boxing. Basically where boxing went from this to this. Like I personally think that even though times are evolving so much faster because the rate of information is being shared so much faster and more efficiently. I mean, that's an obvious thing. You could argue that where we are in MMA right now has been sped up by way of that sharing of information versus boxing was a little bit slower. It's likewise how I think women's MMA has sped up so much quicker. I mean, you go from having Ronda Rousey pioneering women in the UFC. What year did Ronda Rousey enter the UFC? 2000 what? 11, 12?
2012 maybe?
12?
April 2018.
No, she didn't debut in 2018.
You're right. Well, it says
I know I'm right.
Ronda Rousey debut.
that was maybe
No, I think it was. I think 2010.
Okay, so 2010.
first law of 2015.
Okay, so 2010. That
That was a long time ago.
A long time ago. Jesus Christ. So anyways, 2010, 2012, you got that whole era right there of women coming into MMA. And, now we have fucking Rose Namajunas and Whaley. And these girls look like guys fighting. And I mean look like guys. I'm not talking about physically or
But the performance is on par.
Is because it's so sped up because
Not that it shouldn't be. We
Right.
expect it to be that
right,
way.
yeah. But where does the term come from looking like a guy fighting? Well, that just simply gets to the point where guys have been doing it longer. So
Right.
guys have become more proficient over time. And so now you look at women, I mean, look at Joanna Jędrzejczyk, for crying out loud, she's a beast. But the likes of her and Wei Ling and Rose Namajunas, they have these. They look. That's how good they look because it's obviously been sped up. But what I mean is, in the era in which we are, we're still time frame wise from the 1990s to now. We're still kind of in the Ali era. So I love MMA purely because we're in such a revolutionary. We're still an evolutionary state.
It's evolutionary, but Ali had a foil. I mean, Ali had Frazier. Ali had Foreman. Ali had Ken Norton. In the 80s, we had those great battles between
Four Kings. Yeah.
Yeah, we had Duran, and we had Leonard, and we had Hagler, and we had Hearns. And I think something that makes combat sports great is, first, for a combat sport to be great, you need a dominant, charismatic, marketable heavyweight, which we don't have. And you can say whatever you want about, and this doesn't take anything away from their fighting ability.
You think it always has to be a heavyweight, though?
No, you and I are different because we're involved intimately in the sport. For you to turn someone on to the sport, I think it helps to have a heavyweight. The biggest, baddest motherfucker. Not like the slickest little guy with
like the
crazy
Tysons
footwork.
and the Alis and
or you
the
need
Holyfields and Lennox Lewis's.
You need the heavyweight, and in addition, or in absence of the dominant heavyweight, you need great rivalries. Name a great MMA rivalry right now?
Current.
I
guess we don't have one right now.
Right, and I think we need that. And I think the UFC misses opportunities to create these rivalries because they allow sometimes the fighters to call the shots a little bit too much. I thought that there was a humongous missed opportunity. It's selfish because I want to have my cake and eat it too. There was a great opportunity to have a third fight between Conor and Nate. I think Conor probably wins that because Nate kind of fights the same fight every time, and Conor seems to make a lot of great adjustments. And I think he's very difficult to beat twice because of that. But I think that you miss an opportunity. Nothing makes more money than the rematch except for the trilogy. Right? So, I mean, why didn't we do that?
1-on-1. That's arguable. That's,
the shit talking was marvelous.
What I think we're going to see before Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor trilogy is a McGregor-Khabib sequel.
I think you're right.
And I think that's what Dana's big thing was the other night was, hey, look, Conor's coming back. Coronavirus is starting to lift. They're going to fight. We can have people. I mean, there was people in the stands last night.
Yeah, it was great.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I think Dana's turning around to Khabib saying, you can make a lot of money. You can make a lot of fucking money. And I don't see why if Conor beats Poirier that we shouldn't have, given the fact that Poirier beat Holloway and Poirier was basically the man in that division. And I mean, I think if Conor beats Poirier, I mean, that's the fight. Khabib. I'd rather watch Khabib Conor 2 than Khabib George St. I don't want George St. Pierre to come back.
I don't want to see that. That's a novelty act.
I don't want to see George St. Pierre come back purely because I don't want to see George St. Pierre concede to having to come down to 165. Like, that's retarded. You're the fucking legend of the game. Why are you making all these talks about getting down to 155 and 165? That motherfucker should be fighting you at 170.
And also, you don't want to create a situation where Conor beats GSP or someone beats GSP. Khabib maybe beats him. And now you're talking about, well, GSP was retired for so long. He's old.
It's just retarded shit. I don't want to see that. I think George St. Pierre is hands down one of the absolute greats of the game, and he should just be considered as such and just left alone to believe in aliens and, whatever it is that he wants to believe in. I just don't think, me personally, like, if a fight with Khabib were ever to happen, I just don't like the way George St. Pierre has been, like, all of a sudden, like, talking about how I can make 165. No, bro, you can't. You're old. And even if you can, it's going to be like De La Hoya fighting Pacquiao with that, like, conceded weight where he conceded fucking 15 pounds and went down. Like, what? He butchered himself. Like, and he allowed Pacquiao to just beat the crap out of him. And it was sad. And that's the last fight that De La Hoya had.
Right.
And you're only as good as your last fight a lot of the times.
That's it.
You know? So, like, and even if you do come off a loss, it's like, you want that loss to be as... everybody usually always comes off a loss. Let's face it, Ali came off a loss. A lot of them came off a lot. A lot of guys came off a loss. I mean, I know St. Pierre's last fight was Bisping, and he beat the shit out of him. But his fight before that was Johnny Hendricks. It was very close.
Really close.
Really close. I mean, depending on whose eye you want to really give it to, you could.
There's an argument to be made on both sides there.
Absolutely. But I guess, I don't want to see George. I like that George is left with the middleweight title. He did his thing. Just stay there.
Right.
It's kind of like how I wanted Randy Couture to retire long before he fought Brock Lesnar. After he beat the shit out of Gonzaga, that would have been a beautiful... If Randy Couture had retired at that time, the only fight that ever would have made sense was Fedor. Because
Right.
that was the only talk at the time.
And they were
Fedor.
similar sizes.
And it never happened. And that's sad.
But I feel like that about Khabib. I feel like Khabib walked away now. There's a couple of things at play there. Number one.
Excuse me, John.
Yeah.
It's Khabib.
I'm sorry. It's not my native tongue. But I think, number one, in Western culture, I made a promise to my mom about a ton of shit that I went back on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it means as much to people in Western culture as it does to people in his culture.
Mm-hmm.
So for anyone to say, oh, he made a promise to his mom, who cares, go get rich, we don't really know the kind of weight that carries in his culture.
A lot.
A lot, right? And the other thing is, we don't know that he's driven by money. And maybe he is driven
Probably not.
Yeah. And I think if he wanted to come back and fight Conor, I would love to see it. But I don't want to see him bullied back into the cage by Dana or by anyone else, because you know as well as I do that if your heart and your mind are not in it, you risk serious injury and you risk losing the fight. Everything's got to be firing on all cylinders. Your brain, your heart, everything's got to be into it. And I don't want to see someone bullied back in there and then have a boatload of excuses as to why they didn't perform up to their level. If he wanted
and then having a trilogy and then
Right.
But can I be honest?
Yeah.
Connor said something the other day. I don't know where it was. I can only assume. I don't follow much about Connor, as funny as that sounds, but I can only assume it was said in the most recent days leading up to this fight that's happening this weekend. But he said something that he goes, I fought the best of him that night, and he fought the worst of me that night, and he knows that if we were to fight a third time, that I have the answer to that. And I have to be honest with you, being somewhat in contact and talking to Conor a lot throughout that Khabib camp, he wasn't taking him serious. He was not. And I was not surprised that when Conor fought the way he fought, hands down, walking in, flat-footed, I was like, what the fuck's going on here? And then the first shot that Khabib took, he was genuinely believing, oh, I'm going to wrestle with this guy. No, you're not. No. Why are you going to wrestle with a guy who comes from an area which is the mecca of wrestling, and then he's out in California wrestling with guys who they bring out purposely for him to constantly wrestle with? Like, Khabib is not the best wrestler in the world. I mean, let's put it quite simply. I mean, you and I both know Bekzad Nurmagomedov.
Abdu Rakhmonov.
Yeah. And shout out to Moose, his brother, who's an absolute legend. I still talk to Moose as often as I can, and but Beck would fucking absolutely mop the floor with Khabib in a wrestling match. I mean,
in a wrestling match, right?
He's like an Olympic, potentially Olympic bronze medalist. You know what I mean? He's unbelievable.
But there are two sides to that. I think when we look at Khabib's wrestling for MMA, one of the things we look at is the fact that he sometimes takes shots from too far away, and he doesn't set them up. But I also think that, first of all, MMA wrestling, as we all know, is totally different.
100%.
I mean, there's a hand fighting aspect to it when you're talking about like folk style or freestyle wrestling that doesn't exist in MMA. That's set up by the strikes. But the other thing that I think is harder to see, that I hear people talk about, and I've never wrestled Khabib, I've never trained with Khabib, is that when he gets on top of you, it's unbelievable pressure. You can't move, you can't do anything. So I think that takedowns are one aspect of wrestling, but top control is another aspect of wrestling that may be difficult to quantify just from seeing it while we, sit and eat our bottom.
But also, too, that top pressure is also relevant to who's on bottom. I mean, you could say that, what's his name? Who's the guy that, my brother, no, I'm got Gilbert, is it Gilbert
Burns?
Gilbert Burns.
Yeah.
I mean, there was talk saying like that's the guy that's going to beat Khabib because he's retarded good on the ground. I mean, you're talking about a guy who
world champion.
Talk about pressure. I mean, talk about a guy who would probably eat the pressure off his back. Who knows? We don't know. It hasn't happened yet. I've seen him tweet the other day. Where's the announcement? Maybe saying that he's going to come back and I don't know. It's a shame that we never got to see Gilbert Burns get that shot because wasn't Gilbert Burns? What happened with that fight? Gilbert Burns was to fight him and then ended up being Gaethje, or what happened?
There are so many different.
Gilbert Burns smashed. Who did he smash? He smashed one guy there at one point. They were like, it's going to be Gilbert Burns versus Khabib, and then it never happened.
Who did Gilbert Burns fight, Guido?
He buried it was Tyrone Woodley. Oh, okay, no, sorry. I misunderstood. Gilbert Burns, they said, was the answer to Usman. Who's the guy that they said was the answer to Khabib? There was a guy in that division. They said it was going to be the answer to Khabib.
Charles Oliveira?
I forget who it was. Again, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on here. All I'm saying is that me personally, I actually, even though I have my own critiques about McGregor, and I actually truly do believe that had he taken Khabib seriously, which he wholeheartedly did not, and I can absolutely testify to that talking to him at the time and watching his training and who he was training with and how he was training, and even the shite, as we say, that he was talking about in the lead up to the fight. Well, if there's a wrestling situation, I'm all for it. Like, no, you're not, idiot. Don't do that. No. Why do that? Why try and fight a snake in his own game, or fighting a crocodile in his own era, like in his own area? Just fucking do your thing. And when he walked out with his hands down nonchalant, and then he's getting beaten down and he's trying to play it off, you've already lost the fight. John, you might know this as much as I do, but when you underestimate somebody, when you fight, it's too late to make the adjustment in the ring.
Yeah.
There's only one fighter that I've ever seen make the adjustment from underestimating somebody and still win, and that's John Jones against Gustafsson. John Jones absolutely underestimated and overlooked Gustafsson. You could just tell all the fight build-up, all his, commentary, everything leading up to it, and then he gets in the ring and fucking Gustafsson's putting it on him. And then John Jones manages to keep it going throughout the 3 rounds. And then that 4th round of that fake single spinning elbow to the forehead burns him big time.
That's what won him the fight, I think.
That's what won him the fight. But that's why I always say, for me personally, I feel like John Jones is one of the greatest of all time, because it's the only time I've seen somebody underestimate somebody and still really put. You could say Anderson Silva versus
Chael Sonnen,
the first fight.
Yeah, that was a great fight.
Unbelievable. I remember where I was. Where were you? It was in Boston.
I was at the greatest bar.
I was sitting in Peter Welch's gym when it was still across the street before you moved to the new spot, watching it. And I'm like, holy shit, Chael Sonnen's going to win this fight. And then
I swear to God, I thought he was going to win. That was outrageous. But going back to the Jones and Gustafsson, don't you think that was an opportunity wasted by the UFC? How long was it between the first Jones-Gustafsson fight and the second one?
I agree.
I mean, it went on for so long, and Gustafsson had other fights, and he kind of, he retired.
But wasn't that down to, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that down to John Jones's personal life, where he got fucked up and he crashed into that pregnant lady, and then he got arrested and cocaine? I think he fucked the I think that came down to a matter of Jones fucking himself.
Right. I don't know the timeline of all his personal issues. It was 5 years in between
those two fights.
Right.
So I do believe that part of the reasons were John.
Wow. That's so long. But
what the fuck?
The UFC should have been giving Gustafsson fights to stay sharp. In that time, didn't he get knocked out by Rumble? He beat Glover.
I was just looking at John Jones's record between the two Jones fights. He got beat by Johnson and Cormier, and then he strung 2 wins together
against Glover.
Was it Black Witch?
Wait, Rumble Johnson knocked him out?
Yeah, that was bad too. It was a bad knockout.
I never saw that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a bad knockout. Wow. But in my opinion, okay, maybe
that's the fight we never got to see, was Jones versus Rumble.
Yeah, that would have been a good one.
Remember they did the build-up where they pushed each other on stage to kind of fuck with Dana White?
A bunch of bullshit.
What ended up happening? Was that when John Jones went on his fucking coke raid?
I think there was another picogram instance. I don't know what happened. But what I think should have happened after the first Jones and...
I got a story for you about picograms after this.
Okay. Jones fought Gustafsson was, even if Jones had personal issues that got him suspended or whatever, the UFC should have been feeding Gustafsson stay sharp fights and giving him a little extra money on the side to stay training and stay healthy. Because the big money fight there is that rematch. And, they may have wasted it. And I think that, again, got to have the rivalries for the sport to grow.
What is pretty incredible, though, and I'll say this about John Jones, again, credit to him. And I feel like I can't say it's equal to a McGregor, Khabib or Khabib rematch. But when John Jones all of a sudden took Gustafsson serious, what happened? Well, he crushed him.
Yeah,
he crushed them.
You're right about that, but Gustafsson was not the same human being. He had retired already.
Really?
He was retired. They brought him back from being retired. He had the brutal knockout from Rumble Johnson. I mean, it's
but he
just
had beat, but he had beat Glover Teixeira, and he'd had a string of wins right before.
two. Jan Blachowicz.
After two losses, back-to-back losses between Johnson and Cormier, he put those two wins together against Teixeira.
Let's be fair. Glover is as tough as it gets, but he's old and slow.
But look where he's gone now, though. Glover's kind of made a comeback now.
What is that? Does that say more? Does that say more about Glover or more about the division he's in?
And that's. I mean, I understand where you're coming from.
Guy's like
that.
40 years old and he's slow.
But he's a slow starter, but he makes these like crazy comebacks. But again, I'm saying about John Jones, still a guy who's aged, been out of the sport, been forbidden to participate in the sport. Gustafsson, who's fought while Jones was out, and then all of a sudden they meet and he just like decimates him.
Yeah.
I just think it's a matter of when you underestimate a guy and then you don't underestimate him. I mean, I've been there before where I've underestimated a guy and I've suffered the consequences in the middle of the fight.
Who was the toughest person you ever fought?
The one fight that I can ever say that I lost hands down, and I didn't overlook them. Just on the night they were better than me, was actually John Hathaway in 2009. Every other fight that I lost after that, I felt like that it was like either down to my mindset, or I didn't take it serious enough, or I was, up and down, or I over prepared or I under prepared. But that one fight, I felt like I was on the money, and I felt like I was fighting a bear. I felt like I was fighting a bear that night. And
is that a better feeling, knowing that you were on the money and you lost?
Yes.
Versus, I agree.
I like if I'm gonna lose to somebody, I'd rather I know 100% that man was better than me in the night than it to be up to myself. Like there's been a couple of fights where I've had tough fights where I've almost overtrained. I've had my best fighting rounds in the gym, and then all of a sudden I go out to the fight and I've kind of burnt myself out. I kind of like the concept of, when getting ready for a fight, of taking 2 weeks out to completely kind of reset yourself. 1 week to recover and 1 week to make weight. Because I feel like, in the past, I always trained right up until a week out, and then trying to cut weight and recover in the same week is very tough because you're limiting yourself of certain nutrients in order to make weight while your body's trying to recover, and it's very hard. And then that has an effect on your nervous system. Then when you go to compete, versus taking 1 week to recover, to wind down, recover, let your body recover, let all those muscles heal and everything like that, and then go into your dietary, weight cutting week, and then to be able to recover and do all that and then compete. And for me, seeing what other fighters that I know that do that, cooperating with other coaches that do that with their fights, and obviously seeing with some of my guys that I've kind of had the pleasure of coaching in my time recently, which is not a lot, but of the guys that I have, I've seen good results from that. Cutting weight and recovering in the same week, me personally, and seeing other guys do it, it's a 50-50 chance.
Right.
It's who's less fucked on the night.
Right.
Versus having that 2 weeks to say, all right, I'm going to train up, and I'm going to train my balls up until 2 weeks. I'm going to have 1 week to recover, slow train, methodically, just go over certain things, relax, recover, let the muscles recover. And then the week of the fight, you're making your weight. Because obviously you still need certain, even though you're on a diet, you're, a quote unquote diet of like preparing your body and making sure you're having those nutrients. Weight cut week, you always kind of end up pushing the button a little bit.
Right. And there are other obligations. And I think,
correct.
And I think what you're talking about, having that week to recover, that only comes with experience. Because as a young fighter, the first thought on your mind is, I'm not training enough. I need to be training more.
Right.
Sometimes that's an addiction in your brain where you need the dopamine release. And sometimes it's just an insecurity that my opponent might be training in this 7 days, he's going to learn the secret technique to defeat me, which is obviously not true.
And you and I both know that the secret is to train smarter, not harder.
Right.
I mean, that's something that's kind of been coined over a long time, but I feel like...
But it's true, and it's very difficult to swallow that pill. And
I tell when I have young fighters, and I've had some young fighters most recently too. I've had a couple young fighters come to the gym that I'm at right now, and they're hard competitors, wrestlers, and I always tell them, like, Tell me a single civilization that has benefited from cutting themselves with swords and knives before they went out into the battle. You know,
Yeah.
it's like a blunt sword never won any battle. You know, that's one thing I tell my fighters, like a blunt sword never won any battle. It's a sharp sword that wins the battle. And likewise too, when
That's
you're
awesome.
right, like a blunt sword never won any battle. And I never heard that anywhere. It's just something that I kind of, you know, a content like yourself, you're very well read. Likewise, you know, I try to read as much as I can, but I came to the conclusion like a blunt sword never won any battle. And sometimes when you blunt your blade, and likewise if you allow yourself to get cut,
Right.
you know, like you look at the ancient samurai, they would use the bokken, they use the wooden sword to train with each other, and so that they wouldn't get cut up, because they want to make sure that every wound that they get is
Fully
on the
healed.
battlefield. It happens on the or yeah, exactly, that they are the only times they're getting sliced and flesh wounds is on the battlefield, because God forbid you were to go out with scars and the scars open, you're fucked.
Right.
It's not going to lead to a success. So yeah, I often tell my young competitors, I'm saying a blunt sword never wins any battle. So like, you know, make sure that you're sharp. There's something to be said about being sharp. And likewise, you look at the NFL, you look at these guys and like, yeah, they beat each other up every week, but like,
But
you
then
know,
it's walkthroughs the rest of the week.
you know, like, you know, and John, you and I agree on this, like MMA and fighting and boxing is the one sport where you potentially drain yourself 24 hours before you're supposed to make the performance of your life, and you're supposed to somehow compete. And I don't think, I think, and this is where I go, what I alluded to earlier on with the evolution of martial arts and mixed martial arts. I don't think we're fully going to see the peak of martial arts or competitive martial arts till at least maybe another 10 or 12 years from now, where I think ultimately the UFC and other major governing bodies in MMA will have to introduce new weight classes. Because, I mean, in boxing, you have a weight class every 4 or 5
We
pounds.
don't want so many weight classes that people are just bouncing around and, you know, running up and down all the weight classes. I agree. I think it's fair to say
5 pounds.
I mean, you can make that argument. My gut would say it's fair to say every 10 pounds should be a weight class. Guess what? Life's not fair. If you're not near one of those weight classes, you're either fighting, maybe you're fighting at a bit of a disadvantage. But the UFC state athletic commissions are under no obligation to make sure that every person of every body type fits comfortably into a weight class. No one would have been better off with a 195-pound weight class than me.
Right.
I was too small for 205, and I killed myself to make 185.
Right.
So I just think that
10 pounds is good.
yeah,
I
every
like
10
10
pounds.
pounds.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: how old are you now?
32.
Is there another fight in Tom Egan?
I don't know. I mean, you know, me personally, I often look at like we talked about, you're always as good as your last fight and whatnot, which is true in some aspects. I'm not sure another aspect, you know, but you know, you look at how the decline of Ali, or like the decline and re-rise of the likes of Mike Tyson, and you look at, you know, MMA fighters who've also come down, and you know, it's like, I mean, you know, you never know when to say when. And you know, I guess in every fighter's, you know, let's say to do book, it's to do well and maybe make some history along the way. Maybe do well and maybe make some history. I happen to do a little bit of reverse. I made a little bit of history in the beginning, and I did okay along the way. And where I'm at now is I'm at the point in my life where I'm kind of, I have to say that I'm mature enough to now say, I've always said never say never when it comes to MMA.
Right. Or anything.
Well, yeah, of course. That's why I've never turned around and been like, oh, I'm retired. I've never done any big Facebook. And I'm not looking for that attention. I've always left the book open. But for me personally, I think that maybe the page is turned where I have my objectives and where my passion is in life is slightly different than what it is than just simply getting in a ring and beating the shit out of somebody else, or potentially get my shit beat out myself. One thing I do want to do is I want to wrestle more. I do want to wrestle more.
It's tough to do as an adult around here, though, right? You got to go out to Vegas to like Veterans Nationals.
Yeah, and I got to go to Pennsylvania or New York, or I got to go down south, whatever. It's fine. I don't mind that, but I would like to do a few more wrestling / jiu-jitsu tournaments. I would like to do that. I do believe in the concept of keeping sharp, win or lose, you know. And the beauty about grappling tournaments is you can take an ass beating one day, give an ass beating another day. I mean, you know, I've lost tournaments, I've won tournaments, and you know, likewise yourself, it's the same thing. But ultimately, you walk away from those tournaments saying that was a fucking good day. You know, I
Right.
had a couple scraps and not just one, but you had a few,
Right.
and you went against guys who were in
There's nothing that tastes better than a post-tournament beer. You've been living clean for several weeks. You get on weight, and you get to the venue, and you have your
Regardless.
3, 4, 5 matches. Hopefully, you get 5 matches. Man, that first beer is unbelievable.
Now, if you would, if it's funny you asked me about getting into MMA again, the concept of training for 6 or 7 weeks for one fight and then whatever happens on the night, then that's it. If you were to tell me that MMA made a comeback into multiple night tournaments like the old UFCs,
Right.
like 3, 4 night, I'd be as weird as it sounds, I'd be more inclined to wanting to give that a go than
Right.
like 6 or 7 weeks for one fight. I'd be more inclined to do 6 or 7 weeks for potentially multiple fights on the night. 3 fights on the night, I'd be more inclined to wanting to do that than one fight in the night, because it's a lot. It can be a lot of pressure. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's
There's a
weird.
lot, no, that's a psychological thing, though. You put
Yeah.
too often, like when we do these things, you put this pressure on yourself.
Mm.
And in reality, and this is what I tell like my young fighters, you're putting this pressure on yourself because you're worried about what other people are going to think about your
Correct.
performance.
Correct.
This took me a long time to learn. The people who are there to support you, they don't give a fuck if you win or lose.
Correct.
They're living vicariously through you, and they think you're awesome for doing this thing.
Absolutely.
And they just want you to like do well. If you lose a
Absolutely.
fight,
They don't care.
No, they don't.
I've never lost any friends from losing a fight.
No.
Put it that way.
No.
Never lost a single friend or a single supporter from losing a fight.
So
And I think that's like you said, that's exactly on the money what you just said, that when those people come to watch you, they don't care whether you win or lose.
right. Well, that was a lot of fun, and the tank is certainly never short on words or opinions. If you want to find Tom, or if you just want to try and get his Instagram account flagged, the links are in the show notes. And if you dig what we're doing, hit the subscribe button and check out our Patreon page. The link is also in the show notes. If you're looking for a little self-help this week, I recommend you get out there and do some push-ups, rip a shot of tequila, and go kick it to the sexiest person you can find. Your life will get better after that. Until next time, don't overthink it, my bro.